the Lord of the Abyss. Act 1, Drowning Depths. From the silence between dimensions, something ancient opens its eyes. Chapter 1, The Space Between Screams. The dimensional gap, outside recorded time. There was no sound at the beginning. Not silence, precisely, because silence implies the absence of something that once existed. This was the space before absence. The dimensional gap did not breathe. It did not dream. It simply persisted, a wound in the architecture of reality so old that even the oldest gods had forgotten what reality looked like before the wound was made. And into that wound a soul fell. Issei Hyoudou did not scream on the way down. He had used up his screaming somewhere in the span between death and this, somewhere in the long corridor of nothing that preceded the gap. He fell with his eyes open and his mind working, because that was the only thing left to him. He had been a devil. He had been a dragon host. He had been a great many things in a life that had burned too bright and ended too quickly, and now he was a consciousness without a body, tumbling through the space where geometry forgot itself. He noticed, after what might have been centuries or might have been a breath, that he was not alone. The thing that watched him from the dark was not a dragon. He knew dragons. Ddraig had been a dragon, red and magnificent and terrible in the ancient way, full of pride and fire and the clean violence of a creature that understood itself completely. The thing in the dark was nothing so straightforward. It was the suggestion of scale without a body to attach scale to. It was the impression of geometry that human mathematics had never bothered to name. It breathed, if breathing was the correct word for the motion it made, and each breath bent the fabric of the surrounding nothing in directions that had no compass point. It was interested in him. Issei, suspended in void, considered his options. He had exactly none. So he spoke instead. "What are you?" he said, and was surprised that his voice worked at all. The thing in the dark considered this question with all of the attention of something that had existed long enough to give consideration real weight. A beginning, it said, and the word did not come through sound. It came through memory. It came through every forgotten moment of terror in Issei's life, every dark dream, every half-second at the edge of sleep when the world had felt too large and he had felt too small. The thing had been there for all of it, waiting. "That is not an answer," Issei said. "No. But it is the only true thing I can give you. Names are for things that can be contained, and I have not been contained since the world was young enough to try." The presence shifted. Something vast moved in the dark. "I have been watching you for the length of your life, Issei Hyoudou. I found you interesting. I find very little interesting, so you should understand the weight of that. Watching me, you fought dragons and gods with a body designed for something far less remarkable. You refused, consistently and with considerable creativity, to accept the limits placed on you. You loved things too large to hold. You burned. A pause that lasted 12 seconds or 12 years. I appreciate burning. It is rare. Most things in creation simply smolder and go out." Issei processed this. He was aware, distantly, that a wiser person might be afraid. He had never been particularly wise. "What do you want from me?" he asked. "I want to make you a vessel. Not as your dragon made you a vessel. I do not wish to sleep inside you and whisper encouragement. I wish to occupy the same space as you, fully and without reservation, and I wish to see what becomes of the combination. You would not be diminished. You would be." The geometry of the darkness bent again. Changed. Changed how? In ways that cannot be mapped before they occur. That is the nature of real change. Issei looked into the impossible dark and thought about Rias, about Aquino, about the life he had built from nothing and lost at the end of a fight he had still believed he was winning. He thought about Ddraig, sleeping somewhere in the metaphysical distance, a power he no longer had access to. He thought about what it meant to start over. He thought about the ocean. He had always loved the ocean, though he had never been able to say precisely why. The surface, bright and comprehensible. The depths, dark and full of things that had never needed the sun. "All right," he said. The dark moved toward him with the patience of something that had been waiting since before patience was a concept that needed a name. Issei, age 6. He was born in a fishing village on a coast that had no particular fame. The village had a name that translated, in the old dialect, to something approximating the place where the water remembers, and the people who lived there had always understood the sea as a thing with interiority. The sea wanted. The sea remembered. The sea occasionally took. Issei Nakamura, which was the name he wore in this life, was the third child of a fisherman and a woman who read weather in the color of clouds. He was small for his age and given to long silences and to staring at the ocean with an expression that made the other children uneasy. He did not have friends, precisely. He had witnesses to his staring. He remembered everything about his previous life. This was unusual enough that he had, by age 4, determined not to mention it to anyone. He remembered Rias and the Occult Research Club and 3 years of supernatural combat, and he remembered dying, and he remembered the thing in the dark. The thing in the dark was still there. It had settled into him the way a deep current settles into the ocean floor. It was not loud. It did not speak to him in words, not yet. But it was present in the way that gravity is present, not as a voice but as a constant direction, a pull toward depth. He felt it most strongly near the water. On the morning of his 6th birthday, he walked down to the beach before dawn, and sat at the edge of the tide line and pressed his palm flat against the wet sand. The ocean responded. Not dramatically. Not with waves or weather or the cinematic display he might have expected from a supernatural bonding experience. It responded the way a very large animal responds when you place your hand on its flank, with a slow, deep recognition, a shift in attention. Something in the water noticed him back. He held his ground. He had once held his ground against a god, albeit badly and with a great deal of property damage, and that experience had calibrated his threat responses in ways that made a sentient ocean feel manageable. The presence in the water was not the thing inside him. It was something separate, something that had been in the water long before he arrived and would be in the water long after. It was curious about him because the thing inside him was casting a shadow, and that shadow was the shape of something the water had not felt in a very long time. Hello, Issei said, which felt inadequate but was available. The ocean said nothing. But it withdrew the tide 3 inches past its natural limit, and then brought it back, which he chose to interpret as a greeting. He grew up strange, which was the polite local summary. He spent more time in the water than any child who had not grown fins had any business spending, and the water never gave him back anything less than what he had entered with. The ocean was not kind to the fishing boats some seasons, but it had never so much as produced a strong current in the direction of the Nakamura child, and after a while the village stopped being nervous about this and started being quietly grateful. His father taught him to read the water. His mother taught him to read the sky. The thing inside him taught him, in the wordless vocabulary of deep instinct, to read the space between the two, the place where weather and tide negotiated in a language older than either. He was, by 12, the best navigator on the coast. He said nothing about this in public. He had understood, with the particular clarity of a person who remembered being someone else, that demonstrating abilities before you understood their political implications was a reliable method of making powerful enemies. He helped his father find fish. He let his father think it was luck. His father was not fooled. His father was a man who had spent 40 years on water and understood that some things could not be explained by luck and were better not explained at all. He did not ask. He was grateful. Chapter 2, The Grammar of Dark Water. The Deep Coast, 12 years later. The entity inside him had a name, or at least it had the part of a name that could be expressed in a frequency the human brain could process without dissolving. Issei had settled on calling it the Abyss, not from any desire for drama but because the thing itself had indicated, in the nonverbal way it communicated, that abyss approximated something near the concept it used to describe itself. Its actual designation was a geometric feeling that produced nausea when approached directly. They had, over 18 years of cohabitation, achieved something that the thing itself described as unprecedented and that Issei described, in the privacy of his own thoughts, as functional. The abyss did not speak in sentences. It communicated in the way that pressure communicates, in the way that the dark at the bottom of the ocean communicates, not with words but with weight. Issei had learned to parse this weight the way he parsed weather, as information rather than sensation. There is something in the southern channel, he said aloud, standing at the prow of his father's boat in the grey pre-dawn, because speaking the abyss's communications aloud helped him process them. Something that should not be there. His first mate, a taciturn man named Goro who had been with the Nakamura family for 11 years and had therefore developed a high tolerance for the inexplicable, said, "Should we avoid it?" "No," Issei said. "We should go to it." Goro, to his considerable credit, adjusted course without further comment. The southern channel was a stretch of water between two rocky outcroppings that the fishing boats used in summer and avoided in winter, when the currents turned unpredictable. On this morning, in late autumn, with the sky the color of old pewter, and the wind carrying the first real cold of the approaching season, there was something beneath the surface that was not fish, and was not rock, and was not any of the things the channel normally contained. It was a woman. Or the shape of a woman. Or the thing that inhabited the shape of a woman the way the abyss inhabited the shape of a young man. She surfaced slowly, with the deliberate patience of something that had decided to be seen and was therefore taking its time about it. Her hair was the color of deep water in winter, a blue so dark it processed as black in anything less than direct sunlight. Her eyes, when they opened, were the pale luminescent color of things that make their own light in places where no other light reaches. She looked at the boat. She looked at Issei. She held the eye contact with the composure of something that had never found another creature worth looking away from. She was not human. She was not precisely anything he had a word for. The abyss inside him stirred with recognition, which was a sensation approximately like having a compass needle swing true north after years of gentle deviation. "You are the shadow I have been feeling," she said. Her voice came from everywhere the water touched, which, on a boat, was most surfaces. "For 3 seasons now. Moving up and down this coast. Navigating waters that should not be navigable." She tilted her head. Something beneath the surface moved in response to the gesture, something very large. "I came to see what you were." "And what am I?" Issei said. She was quiet for long enough that Goro, behind him, shifted his weight. "Something new," she said finally. "Which is unusual. I have been in these waters for 900 years and I have not seen something new in the last 300 of them." A pause. "I am Kaido. I do not use that name with people who have not earned it, so you should understand what I am telling you. My name is Issei Nakamura. That is a very ordinary name for something that casts a shadow like a tear in the world." "I have found ordinary names useful," Issei said. "People stop paying attention to things with ordinary names." Something moved in her expression. Not quite a smile. The thing that precedes a smile in creatures for whom smiling is a recent acquisition. "You are also perceptive," she said. "I appreciate that less commonly than I should." The abyss pressed outward from him, just slightly, just enough to taste the water around the boat, and Kaido went still in the way that prey animals go still, and then, a half-second later, went still in a different way, the way that apex predators go still when they realize the thing they were watching is larger than they initially calculated. Issei let the pressure recede. He had not decided to demonstrate. But the abyss had its own ideas about what counted as an introduction. "What is that?" Kaido said, and it was the first time she had sounded like something capable of being surprised. "A partner," Issei said. "A very old one. It is interested in you." "Is it?" "Yes. So am I, for that matter." She studied him from the water with eyes that had measured tsunamis and found them adequate. The large thing beneath the surface circled the boat once, slowly, and Goro made a sound behind Issei that was not quite a word but communicated a great deal. "Come back tomorrow," Kaido said. "At dawn." "Come alone." She looked at Goro with the particular attention of something that was deciding whether to consider him relevant. "I will speak with you further." She sank without disturbing the surface. Goro waited a reasonable amount of time and then said, "I would like to request a raise." "Reasonable," Issei said. "I will speak to my father." The following dawn, he came alone, as requested, in a small boat he could manage single-handed, and the ocean was glass flat in a way it had no meteorological reason to be. He anchored in the channel and waited. The thing inside him was, in whatever passed for its emotional register, anticipatory. Kaido rose from the water sitting on the surface of it, cross-legged, the way people sat on floors. The water held her the way floors hold furniture, without drama, as a simple fact of physics. She had brought company. 3 other figures floated just below the surface, visible as dark shapes, present as a statement. My sisters, Kaido said, by way of introduction. They are skeptical. I told them what I felt from your waters yesterday, and they believe I exaggerated. Did you? I never exaggerate. I sometimes fail to capture the full scope of things, which is different. Issei looked at the shapes beneath the surface and at the pale light in Kaido's eyes and thought, with the part of his mind that was always tallying these things, about what it meant that the ocean had been populated with intelligences for centuries and the surface world had never made formal contact with any of them. He thought about infrastructure. He thought about the Occult Research Club and what it had taken to build something functional out of disparate elements with competing interests. He thought about what he wanted. The answer, as it had always been, was everything. But he had learned, in his first life and in the 18 years of this one, that everything was a destination, not a beginning. You began with something specific and you built outward. Kaido, he said, how many creatures like yourself live in these waters? She considered whether to answer. He could see the calculation. In these specific waters, there are 11 of us. In the broader coastal waters of this nation, perhaps 40. In the open ocean she made a gesture that indicated numbers she found inconvenient to specify. Many. Do you have a governance structure? One of the shapes beneath the surface rose slightly, curiosity overcoming caution. We have territories, Kaido said carefully. Agreements. No formal structure. Do you have a method for resolving territorial disputes? We have a method. It is not elegant. Violence rarely is. She tilted her head again. Why are you asking me these questions? Because I am trying to understand what exists before I decide what to build, Issei said. Building without inventory is how you end up with something that collapses under its own contradictions. A silence followed this that was thick with the attention of 4 deep water entities and 1 impossibility from the space between dimensions. Build, Kaido said. An arrangement, Issei said. Between what I am and what you are. The surface world is managed by powers that have, historically, treated the ocean as a resource and its inhabitants as irrelevant. I propose that this change. You propose this. A single man in a small boat. A single man, he agreed, with something very large in the water with him. The abyss moved. Not outward this time, but downward, pressing through him into the water itself, into the deep current beneath the channel, and all 4 of the entities went completely still with the absolute stillness of creatures who have just felt the floor of the world shift. The water in the channel darkened. Not from clouds. From depth, from the sensation of depth rising to meet the surface. From a vast dark pressure coming up from somewhere below the bottom of everything. Issei brought it back. Calmly, without drama, the way you call back a dog that has gone slightly too far. The water returned to pewter gray. One of the shapes beneath the surface broke the water with a face, gasping not from need of air but from the involuntary reflex of shock. She was younger looking than Kaido, with hair the color of coral in firelight and eyes like green bioluminescence. And she stared at Issei with an expression that was trying to be composed and was not entirely succeeding. What, she said, was that? A demonstration, Issei said. I apologize for the dramatics. My partner has strong opinions about introductions. Kaido had not moved. She was looking at him with the expression of someone who has been playing a game for 900 years and has just realized that the board is larger than she thought. Tell me, she said slowly, what you want from us. Issei leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and told her. Chapter 3, Architecture of the Deep. The Underwater Court, 3 months later. The place they brought him was not on any human map. It existed in the space between tidal zones and deep ocean, maintained by a pressure gradient that no natural physics fully explained, lit by the collective bioluminescence of creatures that had agreed, provisionally, to share a territory. It was, Issei thought, the most structurally impressive thing he had seen in 2 lifetimes, and he had seen the raiding game arenas of the Underworld. It was also deeply disorganized, which was both its primary problem and its primary opportunity. He had spent 3 months earning his way here. Not through combat, though there had been combat, 3 separate challenges from entities who had wanted to measure him before accepting his presence. He had won all 3 with the minimum necessary force and the maximum strategic efficiency, which had made a particular kind of impression on creatures who respected dominance, and respected restraint in roughly equal measure. More importantly, he had listened. He had spent 3 months learning the water. Not as a fisherman learns it, not even as a navigator learns it. He had learned it as the abyss knew it, which was to say he had learned the grammar of it, the deep structural logic that governed the relationship between the ocean and the things that lived within it. He had learned which disputes were territorial, which were genealogical, which were about resources, and which were about the kind of ancient insult that had calcified into tradition before anyone thought to question whether the original slight had been worth remembering. He had mapped the politics of a world that the surface had never bothered to look at. Now he sat in a hall of black stone veined with something phosphorescent, surrounded by the 11 entities of the coastal waters and, via the communication channels the ocean maintained, the attention of a great many more. Kaido sat to his right. The coral-haired woman, whose name was Sora and who had been in a territorial dispute with 2 other entities for 60 years over a shipping lane that had changed course 40 years ago, sat to his left with the air of someone who was still deciding how much to trust the arrangement. He had asked them to gather because he had a proposal. He had been clear that it was a proposal, not an ultimatum, because he had found, in his first life, that ultimatums from positions of genuine power tended to produce resentment, and that resentment, while satisfying in the short term, was an inefficient long-term management strategy. He stood. The phosphorescent veining in the walls brightened slightly, which was not his doing and which he filed as useful information. You have been divided, he said, for as long as most of you can remember. Territories overlap. Resources are contested. Agreements made between 2 entities are not honored by a third. Disputes that could be resolved in an afternoon have lasted centuries because there is no structure that anyone is required to bring them to. He looked around the hall. This is not a character failing. It is a structural one. You have been operating without architecture. One of the elder entities, a vast slow-moving presence that Issei had identified as having the oldest territorial claim in the coastal waters, said, "We have managed." "You have survived," Issei said, politely but without softening it. Managing implies a degree of optimization that the current arrangement does not support. You have been losing ground to the surface world for 300 years, not through military defeat but through neglect. Your territorial waters have been reduced. Your resources have been depleted. Your presence in the places you have occupied for millennia has been eroded by infrastructure built by people who were not aware you existed, and would not have cared if they had been. He paused. I propose to make them aware. The hall was quiet in the way that deep water is quiet. You propose to reveal us to the surface world, said a creature Issei knew as Ray, whose form suggested something ancient and angular, one of the deeper water entities who had come at Kaido's specific request. Her voice had the quality of pressure at depth, not loud, but felt in the chest. You believe this is to our benefit. I believe it is inevitable, Issei said. The surface world is expanding. Technology makes the ocean smaller. The question is not whether you will be revealed but whether you will control the terms of your own disclosure. He turned to look at Ray directly. I propose that you do, and you? What role do you play in this proposal? I am the interface, Issei said simply. I understand both worlds. I can operate in both. And I carry something that the surface powers will take seriously, because the surface powers respond to power, and the thing I carry is the oldest power that has ever touched these waters. He let the abyss breathe, just once, just enough. The phosphorescent walls blazed. The water pressure in the room did something that should not have been physically possible in a dry air chamber. Every entity in the room felt it in the oldest part of whatever they used instead of a spine. Then it stopped. I am not threatening you, Issei said. I am showing you what I carry so that you understand what I bring to this table. The surface powers who hold the supernatural world together, the devil factions, the fallen angels, the various clans and councils and coalitions, they have never had to account for the ocean because the ocean has never asked them to. He sat back down. I am asking. Kaido spoke without looking up from the black stone floor. What do you want from us specifically? You have spent 3 months being precise. Be precise now. Issei nodded. Your acknowledgement of a shared structure. Not a hierarchy in the traditional sense. A council, with territories defined and respected, disputes mediated, resources managed collectively. I will represent that council to the surface world. In exchange, the council will have access to everything I can negotiate on its behalf: protection of territorial waters, formal recognition from the supernatural powers, resource agreements that stop the depletion. And if we decline, then I will find another way. The ocean is large and I am patient. He looked around the hall. But I would rather begin with the people who have been here longest. It seems right. The eldest entity made a sound that transmitted through the water and the stones simultaneously, a sound that was 900 years of weight being set down and picked up differently. You are very young, it said. In this body, Issei said. A pause. Begin, it said. The first agreement. They argued for 9 days. Issei had expected this and had prepared for it with the thoroughness of someone who had once spent 3 weeks learning the precise terminology of devil contractual law because imprecision in a contract had cost a friend something irreplaceable. He had thought through every objection before they voiced it. He addressed each one with the particular patience of someone who genuinely was not worried about the outcome, because the thing that most reliably destabilized negotiations was the visible urgency of the party who wanted something, and he had cultivated the ability to want things quietly. Sora was the hardest. She challenged him on the 3rd day with the 70-year territorial dispute, laying the history of it out in exhaustive detail, clearly expecting that the complexity would slow him down. He had already mapped it. He traced the boundary changes, the resource shift, the moment when the dispute had become about precedent rather than the original resource, and he proposed a resolution that gave either party the original object of contention, while providing both with something structurally more valuable. The coral light in her eyes changed. It was not warm, exactly. It was assessing. You did this before we met, she said. I preferred to be prepared, he said. You mapped our entire coast before you asked us to trust you. I mapped it because I needed to understand it. I would have been embarrassed to propose an arrangement I did not understand. She was quiet for a time. You are strange for a surface creature. I have been told. Why the ocean? She asked. The surface world is where your kind of power is visible. The surface world has the politics, the factions, the raiding games. Why come down here? He thought about this seriously, because she deserved a serious answer, and because he had asked himself the same question. The surface world already has people managing it, he said. Badly, in places, but they have the infrastructure, the factions, the centuries of established order. The ocean has been here since before all of that, home to things older than most of the powers that currently divide the surface, and it has been managed by nobody. He looked at the phosphorescent walls of the council chamber. That is either a waste or an opportunity. I prefer opportunities. Sora considered him with the full weight of 60 years of frustration being compared to something she had not expected to feel. I will support the council, she said. Not warmly, but completely. Chapter 4. The Weight of Old Names. 6 months after the first council. The word spread through the water the way real things spread through it, not quickly, but completely. Pressure travels everywhere in the ocean eventually. There is no pocket of still water so isolated that the deep current cannot reach it. The news of the council, of the compact, of the shadow that moved through the coastal waters with the shape of something the deep had not produced in memory, moved outward and downward with the patience of water itself. They came to him, not all at once. Not in delegations with formal requests and prepared arguments. They came the way things that have been alone for a very long time come to something that might not require them to be alone anymore, carefully, with distance maintained until the distance became unnecessary. The first to come from the open ocean was a creature who had no name in any surface language. Issei, who had developed the habit of naming things when they arrived without names, because unnamed things had a way of becoming abstract when they should have remained specific, called her Nami, which was the simplest possible word for wave, and which she accepted with the expression of something that had not been named by anything outside its own kind before. She was vast in the way that open ocean things are vast. She did not take the humanoid form that the coastal entities favored. She was a presence in the water, a shape suggested by pressure and current, a consciousness that perceived him from all directions simultaneously. She communicated in depth variations, in the shift of thermoclines, in the difference between the water at 20 meters and the water at 200. Issei had gotten better at reading this. You have made an arrangement with the coast, she communicated, in the Abyss translated grammar he had been refining for months. I have, he said. He was sitting in the water rather than floating above it, because he had found that the entities took his presence more seriously when he was actually in the ocean rather than on top of it. The Abyss kept him warm. The Abyss kept him breathing. He had stopped asking how. The coast is small. The coast is a beginning. She moved around him in a pattern he had come to recognize as evaluation. The open ocean entities did not challenge through combat as consistently as the coastal ones. They challenged through sustained scrutiny, through the slow, patient assessment of something that had observed a great many things and had developed precise criteria for interest. What do you want? She asked. He had been asked this question enough times that he had refined his answer to its essential structure. To build something in the ocean that has not existed before. A power with the ocean as its base and the deep as its foundation. Not in opposition to the surface world. In relationship with it, as an equal. The surface world does not treat the ocean as an equal. Not yet. Another circuit of evaluation. The water temperature shifted around him, which was not weather. The thing you carry, she said? I feel it from here. I have felt it since you entered the open waters. It is from the gap. Yes. Things from the gap have come to the ocean before. They do not stay. They consume and they move on. I know. I am not the gap. The gap is something I carry. There is a difference. How do I know the difference is real? He thought about this. It was a genuinely good question and deserved something better than reassurance. You don't, he said. Not yet. You know it because you observe the difference over time, not because I tell you about it now. I can tell you that I have had this thing in me for 18 years and the coast is not consumed. But that is recent, from your perspective. You are honest about the limitation. I have found that dishonesty about limitations is a reliable method of creating situations I am not prepared for. The water pressure around him shifted again, and this time there was something in it that he had learned to identify as humor. The way that things so large they have moved past irony still manage to find certain juxtapositions interesting. Come to the deep water, she said. In 3 days. I will bring others. We will hear your arrangement. She dispersed into the thermocline. Issei floated in the open ocean and let the Abyss process what had just happened, and the Abyss communicated back something that he had learned, over 18 years, translated most accurately to the word pleased. The Deep Council. 3 days later he went down. Not physically, or rather not only physically. The Abyss permitted him depths that his body should not have survived, because the Abyss had opinions about pressure, and about what counted as a limit, and those opinions carried geological force. He went down until the light from the surface was a theoretical concept rather than a practical one. He went down until the water was cold in a way that the word cold inadequately described. They were waiting for him. He had anticipated something like the Coastal Council. He had not anticipated the scale. The open ocean had been home, in the untracked centuries of its existence, to things that had no surface analogue, no mythological category, no name in any tradition he knew. They were not sea monsters in the theatrical sense. They were sovereign intelligences that had chosen the deep because the deep was the last place that remained large enough to accommodate what they were. He counted 11 distinct presences in the immediate vicinity, and felt the edge of perhaps 30 more at the periphery, maintaining cautious distance. More than he had brought the Abyss to bear in front of. More than he had addressed at once. He did not let himself feel small. He let himself feel proportionate. Nami was there, vast and patient, occupying the center of the assembly with the authority of a host. Beside her, a presence that identified itself as older than the current shape of the tectonic plates, and that Issei chose to call Abyssia for reasons he kept to himself. And others, ranging in scale from merely enormous to the kind of enormous that suggested that scale was a concept they had grown out of. He spoke for an hour. He did not rush. He had learned that deep ocean entities process time differently from coastal ones and that rushing produced the impression of superficiality. He laid out the arrangement he had built with the coast and the extension he proposed for the open ocean, the same principles, the same architecture, applied to the specific conditions and concerns of the deep. He answered questions for 3 hours after that. The questions were different from the coastal questions. The coast had asked about territory and resources and the practical mechanics of the arrangement. The deep asked about time. About what the arrangement looked like in 50 years. In 500. About what he was building toward and whether the structure could survive him. He had thought about this. The arrangement should not require me to function, he said. If it does, it is not an arrangement. It is a personality cult. I am building a structure that outlasts the person who built it, or I am wasting everyone's time. Abyssia, who had been present as a slow geological pressure rather than anything with a shape, communicated something that required the abyss to translate for several seconds before it came through. You have built things before, she said. He paused. In the 2 lives he had lived, there were not many presences that had cut through the surface of a conversation to the thing underneath it quite so directly. In another life, he said. And you know what you failed to build correctly? Yes. Tell me, he told her. He told her about the occult research club and the raiding game and the supernatural political structure that he had participated in without ever fully understanding, and about the things he had built on loyalty rather than architecture, and about how loyalty, while real, was not load-bearing in the way that structure was load-bearing. Abyssia was quiet for a long time. You learned this from failure, she said. Yes. Good. Things learned from failure stay learned. Things learned from theory are abandoned when they become inconvenient. She shifted. The geological pressure adjusted. Around them, the deep water carried the communication to every entity in the assembly simultaneously. We will join the compact, Abyssia said. I speak for the deep floor. Others will speak for themselves. One by one, over the next hour they spoke. Not all of them agreed. 6 of the 30 peripheral presences declined, which he had expected and which he had made provisions for, because a structure that required unanimity was a structure that could be destroyed by a single holdout. He acknowledged their position without argument, and invited them to observe rather than participate, which was both genuinely offered and strategically useful, because observation was the first step toward eventual participation. When it was done, he floated in the deep dark and felt the weight of what had just been built. A structure that covered the coastal waters and the open ocean and the deep floor, that connected entities who had never spoken to each other, that created a common interest where none had existed. The abyss inside him did something that he had learned, over years, to identify as satisfaction. It felt like depth. Like standing at the edge of something very large and understanding, for the first time, the full extent of what you were looking at. He began the long rise back toward the surface, toward his body's limits, toward the next problem. He was, he thought, just getting started. Chapter 5. The Surface Looks Down. The Supernatural Council, 3 months later. Lord Reiser had not survived 40 years of devil politics by being caught off guard. He had survived them by being the person who caught others off guard, which required maintaining an information advantage precise enough to make surprises feel like scheduled events. He had people in every relevant faction, observers in every major territory, and a network of informants that covered the known supernatural world with the thoroughness of a very expensive and very paranoid map. The report that arrived on a Tuesday, from 3 separate sources who did not know each other, should therefore not have been a surprise. It was a surprise. He read it twice. He poured himself a drink and read it a 3rd time. The drink was unnecessary, but it gave his hands something to do while his mind processed the implications. The report said, collectively and from different angles, that something new was moving in the world's oceans. Not a creature, the informants were careful to specify, not a single entity, or a territorial dispute of the usual kind. A compact. A structure. Something with an architect. It said, further, that the entities of the deep, which the supernatural powers had collectively treated as unorganized and irrelevant for as long as anyone had been managing the supernatural world, had agreed to a council. That this council was operational, and was already resolving disputes that had produced indirect surface disruptions for centuries. That the architect of the council was human in appearance. That the architect of the council carried something in him that 3 separate deep water entities, on 3 separate occasions, had described to his informants, as the oldest thing they had ever felt. Reiser considered this for a long time. Then he composed a very careful message to 12 people, none of whom knew about each other's involvement in his network, and sent it. The message contained one question. Has anyone made contact? 8 of the 12 replied that they had not. 3 replied that they had tried and been politely acknowledged and given no further access. 1 did not reply, which Reiser found significantly more interesting than any of the other responses. The one who did not reply was a half-breed, theoretically outside faction politics, who operated on the northern coast and who had been, until recently, one of Reiser's more reliable sources for coastal supernatural activity. Reiser sent a second message to a different list. Find out who is building an empire at the bottom of the ocean, and do it quietly. The village, simultaneously. Issei's father was 63 and had the particular health of a man who had spent his life in salt air doing physical work, which was to say he was better maintained than his age implied, but beginning to show the weight of decades in his hands and in the set of his shoulders at the end of a long day. He was also not, his son reflected, a fool. Something has changed, his father said, sitting across from him at the kitchen table in the evening with the sound of the water outside the window. Not a question. His father had stopped asking Issei questions about the ocean years ago, not from lack of curiosity but from the pragmatic understanding that the answers came in their own time. Yes, Issei said. Large change or small change? I expect it will be large. His father poured tea and did not say anything for long enough that the silence became comfortable rather than loaded. Your mother knew something was different about you from the beginning, he said. She never said anything. You know how she was. But I could see her knowing. I know. She would have been proud. Whatever this is. Issei looked at the man who had raised him in this life, who had been patient with the staring at the ocean and the unexplained navigation and the entirely reasonable first mate who had eventually required a modest hazard supplement as part of his employment compensation. Thank you for not asking, Issei said. Thank you for being worth not asking about, his father said, and returned to his tea. Outside, the ocean continued its work. Kaido was out there somewhere, managing the compact's first formal territorial mediation. Sora was establishing the communication protocols with the intermediate depth entities. Nami was carrying the compact's parameters outward into the open ocean, that vast pressure moving through the deep water the way real things move, completely. And somewhere further out, in the waters beyond the territories they had consolidated, a message was traveling from the surface world downward, the first formal inquiry, the first acknowledgement that something in the ocean had become worth addressing. He had been expecting it for 2 months. The surface powers were slow to notice things that did not advertise themselves, but they noticed eventually. Their entire management structure was built on noticing potential threats to the established order. He finished his tea. He looked at the window, at the dark water visible beyond the glass. He was 24 years old in this body and had been building in the dark for 2 years and was now, as of approximately this moment, known. The abyss communicated something brief and certain, the deep current equivalent of here we go. Issei, for the first time in a long time, smiled. Act 2, the first shore. The surface world extends its hand. The deep considers whether to shake it. Chapter 6, Emissaries. The northern coast, early winter. The emissary arrived by boat, which was the first interesting choice. The supernatural world had 100 more efficient means of traversal, gates and teleportation circles and the various metaphysical shortcuts that the powerful maintained the way certain people maintained expensive vehicles, for the pleasure of demonstrating the capacity. Coming by boat said something deliberate. It said, I am observing your rules. Issei watched the vessel from the cliff above the village for 20 minutes before going down to the dock. He used the time to think. The abyss used the time to assess the boat's occupants through the water it sat in, because the abyss had, over the years, developed a preference for thorough intelligence before direct contact. There were 3 of them. The one who stood at the prow had the bearing of a person accustomed to being looked at, the particular upright posture of someone who had spent a long time in rooms where their entrance was the event everyone had been waiting for. She was tall, black-haired, formally dressed in a way that suggested she had put effort into appearing less formally dressed than her actual rank required. A calculated informality. He appreciated the craft of it even while cataloging it as technique. The two behind her were security. He noted their positioning, their weight distribution, the way their attention moved. Professionals? Not the most expensive professionals the faction that sent them could have deployed, which was itself a signal. This was not a threat display. This was a conversation opener. He went down to the dock. She saw him coming and did not move, which meant she had been watching the cliff and had calculated the timing herself. Points for preparedness. Issei Nakamura, she said, when he was close enough for normal conversation. Not a question. Statement of confirmed intelligence. Yes, he said. And you are? Seraphina Ashford. I represent a coalition of interests that has been monitoring unusual activity in the world's oceans for the past several months. She met his eyes with the direct contact of someone who had decided that indirection would not work and had therefore chosen a different strategy. We would like to speak with you about what you have built. A coalition, he said. Which factions? A fractional pause. She had not expected the direct question, or rather she had expected it, and had prepared an evasion, and she was deciding whether the evasion was worth deploying. 3 Devil Houses and the Fallen Watchers Western Council, she said. Independently, as yet. They have not formally combined their interest. They each sent a representative to an informal gathering, and I was the consensus choice for outreach because I have the least offensive history. That is a remarkably honest answer. I have found that trying to mislead people with better information than you have is a reliable method of losing the opening of a negotiation, she said. Something in her expression shifted, reassessing. You are younger than the reports suggested you would be. How old did the reports suggest? The entities of the deep ocean do not describe age the way surface creatures do. The impression they communicated was not of a young man. It was of something with a great deal of history. Both descriptions are accurate, Issei said. Come inside. I will make tea. We can talk about what your coalition wants and I will tell you what is and is not available. She studied him for another moment. Behind her, one of the security personnel shifted weight slightly, the micro-adjustment of someone recalibrating. All right, Seraphina said. The fisherman's house, 2 hours later. His father had gone to his sister's for the week, which Issei had arranged in advance not because he was certain this meeting would happen but because he had calculated a 40% probability that an emissary would arrive within the month, and had decided that 40% was sufficient to create conditions for a private conversation. His father had not asked why he wanted the house. His father had taken his bag and patted Issei on the shoulder and gone. The security personnel had been persuaded, with the polite firmness of someone who understood both the request and the objection, to remain outside. They stood at the dock looking like 2 people trying to appear casual about a situation that was not casual. Seraphina sat across the kitchen table from Issei and held her tea with both hands and looked at him with the concentrated attention of someone who had been briefed on the situation and had discovered that the briefing was insufficient. Tell me what you know, he said. What your coalition believes is happening out there. We believe you have organized the supernatural inhabitants of the world's oceans into a governance structure, she said. We believe this structure has operating protocols, territorial agreements, and a dispute mediation function. We believe it encompasses the coastal waters, the open ocean, and the deep floor, and that it has representatives from every depth category with a notable presence in the waters we have historically monitored. She paused. We believe you are the architect and the primary point of contact. That is largely accurate, Issei said. We also believe, she continued, that you carry something in you that the deep entities describe in terms that none of our scholars have a satisfactory framework for. Something that is neither sacred gear nor devil power nor anything on the established supernatural taxonomy. Also accurate. She set down her tea. What is it? Something from the dimensional gap, he said. Not the gap itself. Something that was in the gap and chose to relocate. A silence. He watched her processing the implications. She was good at processing, he noted. She did not reach for the comfortable misinterpretation. She sat with the uncomfortable accurate one and let it settle. The gap is not supposed to produce things capable of choosing, she said. Most assumptions about the gap are based on observations from the outside. Things look different from inside. You have been inside the gap. Briefly. Between lives. Another silence. This one was longer and had more architecture to it, the silence of a person rearranging a significant number of operating assumptions. What do you want? She asked. Your coalition, your deep compact, whatever you have built out there. What is it working toward? Issei considered how much to say. He had prepared multiple versions of this answer, ranging from the strategically minimal to the genuinely complete, and had spent considerable time thinking about which version was appropriate for which audience. The minimal version was safer but produced incomplete information in the other party, which produced bad decisions, which produced situations he had not prepared for. The complete version was vulnerable but accurate. He chose complete. The ocean is 70% of the surface of this world, he said. It has been populated by sovereign intelligences for longer than the devil factions have existed, longer than the fallen watchers organized themselves, longer than most of the structures that currently manage the supernatural world have been in operation. Those structures have managed the ocean the way they manage it, which is to say they have not managed it. They have ignored it. They have extracted from it. They have used its territorial waters as operational corridors without acknowledgement or agreement. He looked at her directly. I am building a structure that changes that. The Deep Compact is a government. It will represent the interests of the ocean's inhabitants in every negotiation that affects ocean territories. It will be party to every treaty that involves ocean resources, and it will have the capacity to enforce its interests. Because a government without enforcement capacity is a petition. Seraphina was very still. That is, she said carefully, a significant restructuring of the established order. The established order did not establish itself by consensus with the parties it affected, Issei said, not unkindly. It established itself by accumulation. I am simply continuing the process. The factions will not accept a new power with the scope you are describing without considerable resistance. I know. That is why I am telling you before I am in a position where resistance is futile, rather than after. Coming to you now, when the compact is young and the relationship is new, gives your coalition the opportunity to shape how this develops. That option closes as the compact matures. She looked at him for a long time. You are very direct, she said. I have found that the time spent managing the consequences of indirection exceeds the time saved by it. How old are you? 24, he said. In this life. The corner of her mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was the gesture that precedes one in people who have decided that a situation is interesting enough to warrant the honesty of an actual reaction. I will need to report to my principals, she said. This is substantially beyond my mandate for a first conversation. I expected that. Tell them I am available for a second conversation at their convenience. Tell them also that the compact will be expanding its territorial governance over the next 3 months into waters that several of their operational agreements currently use without acknowledgement. I am not moving to dispute those operations. I am moving to have them formally recognized. Recognized by whom? By me. As the compact's representative. He picked up his own tea. Which means the conversation is in everyone's interest. She stood, smoothing her coat with the controlled movement of someone re-establishing their professional composure. I will convey your message. Thank you for coming by boat, he said. It was a considerate choice. She paused at the door. You noticed. I notice most things. She left. The sound of the ocean came back into the room the way it always did when other sounds departed, filling the space with the patient presence of something that had been there before the conversation, and would be there after. Issei sat with his tea and let the abyss process the encounter and communicated back a summary to the compact's council through the deep current channel they had established. Kaito received it somewhere in the southern channel. Abyssia received it at the floor of the deep ocean, where she had been receiving communications for longer than the current configuration of the continents. The reply came back in the grammar of water, in depth shifts and current variations, and it said, understood. Chapter 7. What the Old Water Remembers. The deep floor, 1 week after the emissary's visit. Abyssia had a form when she chose to use one. She rarely chose to. Form was a concession to the perceptual limitations of the perceiver, and she had spent most of her existence among things whose perceptual limitations were not the limiting factor in an interaction. But she used one now, for Issei, because she had decided that some conversations required the precision that bodies enforced, the way that a frame enforces the subject of a painting. She appeared as an old woman. Not old in the way of surface creatures, not the soft decline of tissue and the narrowing of horizon. Old in the way of geology, old in the way of the ocean floor, old in the way of things that have been subject to enormous pressure for so long that they have become something fundamentally different from what they started as. She was small and still, and her eyes were the color of the water at 3,000 meters, a darkness that was not the absence of color but the presence of so much color that the human eye processed it as none. She sat across from Issei on the ocean floor, and the water above them was a ceiling, and the bioluminescence of the trench walls was their light source, and nothing about this was strange to him anymore. "The surface has come to you," she said. Not a question. She had received his report. "The surface has sent an emissary." "That is the beginning of coming. The actual arrival will take longer. Tell me about your previous life's experience with these factions." He had known she would ask this eventually. He had been preparing his answer not as a defense but as a genuine assessment, the way you prepare for a conversation with someone whose judgment you respect. He told her about the Underworld and its politics, about the 3 factions and the Great War and the cold equilibrium that had replaced it. He told her about the devil families and the raiding game and the way power was demonstrated and exchanged in that world. He told her about the fallen angels and the stray exorcists, and the various independent parties who navigated the spaces between the major powers. He told her what he had observed about their weaknesses. Abyssia listened with the patience of the tectonic. She did not interrupt. She did not redirect. She received the information the way the ocean floor receives sediment, layer by layer, building structure. "The devil factions are the most politically sophisticated," he concluded. "They have the longest tradition of formal governance. They are also the most invested in the current structure, because the current structure was largely designed by them. They will be the hardest to negotiate with and the most valuable to have as formal partners, because a compact that has the devil faction's acknowledgement is substantially more difficult to challenge than one they are ignoring. And the fallen angels? Less politically unified. More individually powerful. The Western Council that sent Seraphina is the most organized faction of the Fallen Watchers. They are interested in stability because instability has historically cost them more than the other factions. That is a point of leverage. You intend to use leverage. I intend to use every available tool in the correct situation, he said. Leverage is one. Mutual interest is another, and it is more durable. I prefer mutual interest where I can establish it. She was quiet for a time. The trench walls pulsed gently, the bioluminescence shifting through a slow spectrum. "There is something you have not told the compact," she said. He looked at her. "The thing you carry. The abyss. You have told us it is from the gap. You have demonstrated its power to establish credibility. But you have not told us what it wants." He was silent for a moment, not because he was evading but because the honest answer required precise language. "It wants what it told me it wanted when it first spoke to me," he said. "To see what the combination produces. It is genuinely curious. Not in the way that a weapon is curious about what it can destroy. In the way that a very old mind is curious about a genuinely new situation. And you trust this?" "I trust that 18 years of shared existence have not yet produced evidence to the contrary." "That is a different thing from trust." "Yes," he said. "But it is a more honest formulation." Abyssia's form shifted slightly, the way very old things shift when something has registered as significant. "You are aware that the abyss hears this conversation. It is always present." "Awareness is not the right word for what it does. It experiences everything I experience." "Then I will address it directly." She looked past him, or rather looked at him in a way that was also looking through him, at the thing he carried. "I have been in the ocean since before the gap took its current form," she said. "I have felt things come from the gap and pass through these waters. None of them remained. None of them built. You are different. I do not know yet whether different is good." She returned her gaze to Issei's face. "But I am watching. And I appreciate things that earn the watching," the abyss responded. Not in words. In a pressure change that moved through the trench water like a breath, a deep resonance that rattled the sediment on the floor and sent small bioluminescent creatures scattering upward in spirals of pale light. It was, Issei thought, something like a nod of acknowledgement from something that did not have a head. Abyssia watched the spiraling light with eyes that had watched 10,000 years of ocean, and found this particular moment notable. Good, she said. The compact's second full council. He had called it 6 weeks after the first, because 6 weeks was long enough for the initial agreements to have been tested against actual situations, and short enough that the lessons from those tests were still fresh. The compact had, in its first 6 weeks, mediated 4 territorial disputes, resolved 1 resource conflict that had been producing indirect surface disruptions since before the current century, and established a communication protocol that allowed entities at every depth to reach the Council's mediation function within what the deep ocean entities described as reasonable time, which translated to approximately 4 days by surface standards. The 4-day standard had required negotiation. The coastal entities, who operated on something closer to surface time, had found 4 days frustrating. The deep floor entities, for whom 4 days represented a fast response, had found the coastal timeline slightly frantic. He had managed the gap by establishing tiered response categories based on urgency, which was the kind of structural solution that felt obvious in retrospect and required someone to think of it. The second council was larger. The 6 peripheral entities who had declined to join the first compact had sent observers, as he had invited. 3 of them had decided, after 6 weeks of watching, that observation was insufficient, and had asked to join. He welcomed them and noted, privately, that the conversion rate from observer to participant was running higher than his initial projections. Nami was there in her full open ocean presence, occupying a vast space of water above the council chamber in a way that communicated attention without crowding. Kaito sat at his right, as she had at the first council, with the quality of someone who has understood that they have been assigned a role and has decided to inhabit it with complete precision. Sora was on his left again, and she had stopped looking at him with the calculating distance of someone deciding whether to trust and had started looking at him with the more settled attention of someone who has decided and is now interested in what comes next. Rei was present. She had been, in the 6 weeks since the first compact, the most quietly effective member of the council, handling 2 of the 4 territorial mediations personally and producing outcomes that both parties had described, in their respective idioms, as fair. He had noted this and had said so directly when she reported the second mediation. She had received the observation with the expression of someone who was not accustomed to being noticed accurately. He opened the council by reporting on the emissary visit. The reaction was varied and informative. Kaito's water stilled, which was her version of alert attention. Sora's bioluminescence shifted toward a cooler spectrum, which was wariness. Several of the deeper entities produced pressure variations he had learned to read as concern. They will come back, said one of the newly joined entities, who had identified herself as Kira and who had the particular bluntness of something that had spent its existence in very cold deep water where indirection was an unaffordable luxury. They always come back when they smell something new. Yes, Issei agreed. That is what I want them to do. Silence. Of the type that follows a statement that reframes the preceding anxiety. Explain, Abyssia said from wherever she was situated in the deep current below the chamber. The surface factions coming to us as evidence that we are visible and that we are significant enough to warrant a diplomatic response rather than an attempt at suppression, Issei said. Suppression would have been their first tool if they thought we were weak or disorganized. The fact that they sent an emissary means they have calculated that direct action is not their optimal response. They are correct. We are stronger than they know, and we are going to become stronger than they can currently project. He looked around the chamber. Visibility on our terms is a resource. I intend to use it, and if the emissaries' coalition decides that a diplomatic response was a mistake and moves to direct action anyway? Kira asked. The bluntness of cold water. He appreciated it. Then we respond with the tools available to us. The compact controls the majority of the world's territorial waters. Every trade route, every operational corridor, every resource extraction point that crosses ocean territory is subject to our acknowledgement. The surface factions have been operating in these waters without that acknowledgement for centuries. They can continue to do so, or they can have formal agreements that provide them with security and predictability. He looked at Kira. No agreement is more expensive than the uncertainty of having no agreement with the entity that controls your operational environment. You are describing leverage. I am describing reality. Leverage is just what you call reality when it is organized. Kira's cold water presence shifted in a way he had learned meant something like rueful acknowledgement. The council continued. They discussed the expansion of the compact's territorial governance, the specific waters Issei had referenced in his conversation with Seraphina, the formal notification protocols he was drafting. He had written 3 versions of the notification, ranging from the merely firm to the unambiguously authoritative, and presented all 3 for the council's consideration because the decision belonged to the compact, not to him. They debated for 2 hours. This was, he had come to understand, efficient by the standards of deep ocean governance, where decisions of this scale had historically required geological time. They chose the authoritative version, with modifications suggested by Abyssia that made it more authoritative, and by Kaido that made it more precise. The final text was both. He sent it the next morning. Chapter 8, The Warlord's Arithmetic. The Eastern Reaches, Deep Ocean. The challenge came from the east, which he had expected. He had mapped the ocean's political landscape carefully enough to know where the compact's expansion would create friction before it created friction. The Eastern Deep was home to a concentration of sovereign entities who had historically resolved disputes through dominance contests rather than mediation, not from preference, but from the absence of any alternative structure. Into this environment, the compact had sent its governance extension and its formal notification and its invitation to join or to formally acknowledge. The response had been a challenge to Issei personally. He read the challenge with interest. It was well constructed, as challenges went. It named him specifically, which was accurate and avoided the imprecision of addressing the compact generally. It disputed the compact's authority over the Eastern Deep on the grounds that no authority had been established there prior to the compact's formation, and that therefore the compact could not extend into territory it had never governed. This was a coherent legal argument. It also challenged him to substantiate the compact's claim through whatever means he found appropriate, which was the deep ocean idiom for, "Come here and see what happens." The entity who had sent it was called, in the translation the Abyss provided, something approximating the unbroken current. He had been in the Eastern Deep for approximately 400 years and had accumulated a territorial range that made him one of the largest single-entity presences in the ocean. He was not joined to any previous structure because no previous structure had ever asked him to join. Issei had not asked him either. He had sent the compact's standard notification rather than a personal outreach. This had been a mistake, and he filed it as such. He sent a personal message first, before anything else. Not an apology, which would have been read as weakness. An acknowledgement. The notification had been impersonal when it should not have been. He was coming east. He would like to meet before any contest was determined necessary. The unbroken current's reply was brief. Come then. He went. The Eastern Trench, 4 days later. The Eastern Deep was different from the waters he had spent the past 2 years learning. The coastal waters had the character of things that lived in relationship with the surface, influenced by weather and season and the presence of the land. The open ocean had the character of things that had never needed anything outside themselves. The Eastern Deep had the character of things that had decided, a very long time ago, that the universe was a contest and had organized their existence around winning it. The unbroken current was enormous. Not in the way that Abyssia was enormous, not geological. Physical. A mass of water that moved with intention, a current that had become so defined in its course and so dense in its energy that it had developed interiority, that it had become a sovereign presence rather than a natural phenomenon. 400 years of territorial dominance had produced something with the confidence of a thing that had never lost. They met in the trench. Issei had come alone, which the current had noted, and the current had not summoned allies for the meeting, which Issei had noted in return. You are smaller than I expected, the current said. The voice of it moved through the water in a frequency below hearing, felt in the sternum rather than the ears. I hear that frequently, Issei said. The shadow is large. The vessel is ordinary. The shadow is not mine, he said. It belongs to what I carry. The vessel is what I am. And what are you? He answered the question as he had answered it to every entity that had asked it, directly and without embellishment, and the current listened with the patience of something that had been listening to the ocean for 4 centuries and had learned to hear the difference between performance and statement. You have built a structure, the current said, when he had finished. And you want me in it. I want the Eastern Deep in it. That includes your territory and your governance, with your existing arrangements respected and your authority over your territories formally acknowledged. In exchange for what? Participation in the Compact's mediation system when disputes cross territorial boundaries. Recognition of the Compact's external representation. Agreement not to act unilaterally against surface interests in the Compact's operational areas, which creates incidents we all have to manage. You are asking me to constrain my actions. I am asking you to coordinate them. There is a difference. Unilateral action against the surface factions is not something you have done, historically. You have held your territory and managed your waters and not engaged with the surface world at all. Because the surface world was irrelevant, the current said. Yes. And now it has sent an emissary. Not to you. To the Compact. He let that land. The surface world is changing. The question is whether you are part of the structure that manages that change or whether you observe it from outside and deal with the consequences without having influenced them. The trench water moved around them in the massive slow circulation of the current's perpetual motion. Something in the east wall of the trench reflected the movement, as a long luminous wave, pale gold-green in the dark. Tell me about the Compact's mediation, the current said. He told it. He gave the specifics of the 4 mediations completed, the methodology, the principles. He described the council structure and the communication protocols. He described the Compact's approach to the surface world, the notification system, the formal recognition framework. The current listened for a long time. There is a dispute in my eastern boundary, it said. 4 entities. A channel crossing all their territories. I have held the center of it by force for 90 years because no one could agree on anything else. The force has been expensive. Bring it to the Compact's mediation, Issei said. I will address it personally. If you do not resolve it, then I have not earned your confidence, and you will have additional information to use in deciding whether the Compact is worth joining. Either outcome is honest. The current circled him once, in the way that large things circle smaller things to confirm their dimensions. The water pressure of it was significant. The abyss matched it, steadily and without drama, the way a countercurrent matches a current, and the 2 pressures found an equilibrium that was neither dominance nor submission. The current stilled. Resolve the channel dispute, it said. Then we will speak about the Compact. I will return in 2 weeks, Issei said. The channel dispute, 11 days later. The 4 entities of the eastern boundary channel were, in order of their involvement in the dispute, a deep ridge sovereign who had the oldest territorial claim, a migratory presence who crossed the channel twice per year and whose passage disrupted the ridge sovereign's sediment, a current form entity whose natural course ran through the disputed center, and a relatively young entity of perhaps 100 years who had settled on the channel's east bank and had inherited a conflict they had not started and did not fully understand. Issei spent 3 days listening. Not proposing. Not mediating. Listening, specifically and completely, to each of them in sequence, asking the kind of questions that were not rhetorical but were genuinely pursuing information. What did the disruption actually cost? How often did it occur? What would a good outcome look like if they were designing it without the constraint of the existing conflict? What had been tried before? By the 3rd day he had a map. Not a physical map, though he had constructed one of those as well. A map of the underlying structure of the conflict, the actual needs beneath the stated positions, the genuine constraints versus the legacy constraints that had become traditional without anyone deciding they should be permanent. The solution was not elegant. It was functional, which was better. It redirected the migratory presence's twice-yearly passage through a corridor 30 degrees north of the current path, which added distance but removed the sediment disruption entirely. It formalized the current form entity's central course as a recognized transit right rather than an ongoing dispute. It gave the young eastern entity a defined territorial boundary that it had never had, which resolved the ambiguity that had been producing a low-level conflict it had not known how to name. The Ridge Sovereign received an acknowledgement of their primary territorial claim that the previous 90 years of force had never actually provided, because force establishes control but does not establish acknowledgement, and acknowledgement was what the Ridge Sovereign had wanted from the beginning. He presented this to all 4 parties simultaneously, which was logistically complicated in a deep trench environment, and required Nami to serve as relay point, which she did with the equanimity of an entity that had been moving ocean-scale information for millennia. The 4 parties agreed. Not enthusiastically. With the measured acceptance of entities who had expected this to continue unresolved and were recalibrating in response to evidence that it need not. Issei went back to the current. "It is done," he said. The current was quiet for a long time. "You gave the Ridge Sovereign the acknowledgement," it said. That was the thing it had wanted for 90 years, and no one had thought to provide it because no one had asked what it actually wanted. Listening is the cheapest negotiation tool available and the most consistently underused. "You are very strange," the current said. "I have been told." "The compact," the current said. "Show me the membership terms." He showed it. The current read them with the comprehensive attention of something that did not skim. "I will join," the current said, "with the condition that the Eastern Boundary Channel entities are brought into the Compact's formal framework within 60 days. Not as peripheral observers. As full members." "Agreed," Issei said. "And the young entity on the East Bank," the current said. "The one who inherited the conflict. It has no experience with structures like this. It will need guidance. I will assign Ray to work with it." The current paused. "You know your council members well. Well enough to know which of them has the skill set for which situation," he said. "That is what a builder does," the current said. "Not as a compliment, exactly. As a recognition." Chapter 9. The Fallen Watcher's Question. 3 weeks after the Eastern Compact, Seraphina came back, as he had expected, and this time she came alone, which he had not expected and which he found more interesting than her previous visit. She arrived on a Thursday morning in the shallow water north of the village, standing on the surface of the ocean with the casual competence of someone who could do this, and had stopped finding it remarkable. She was not using the boat. She had decided, apparently, that whatever message she was carrying required directness of a kind that a boat complicated. He met her at the waterline. "My principles are divided," she said, without preamble. "I am here without full mandate. I want you to understand that before we continue. I appreciate you saying so. 2 of the 3 devil houses have moved to what their representatives are calling a wait-and-see position, which in my experience means they are watching to determine which response will be most politically advantageous." She looked at the water around her. "The 3rd devil house has suggested that the compact is a power structure that has appeared in their operational territory without their sanction, and that the appropriate response is to treat it as such." "And the Fallen Watchers' Council?" "Split. The minority position, which I hold, is that the compact represents a new reality that will consolidate regardless of the surface world's response, and that the sensible approach is to establish a working relationship now. The majority position is that we should monitor further." "Why did you come without full mandate?" She met his eyes with the particular directness of someone who has decided to be honest about something uncomfortable. "Because I believe the majority position is wrong, and that waiting will make the eventual negotiation harder and more expensive. And because I have read your notifications and I have spoken to the entities who have interacted with you directly, through channels my principals do not know I have." This was interesting. "You have been in contact with the Compact's members independently." "With Kaido. She is accessible and she is, I believe, specifically interested in how the Compact's external relationships develop." He made a note to mention this to Kaido, not as a correction but as a data point. "What does your minority position recommend?" he asked. "A formal back channel. Not a treaty, not yet, but a structured communication between the Compact and the Fallen Watchers' Council that allows both parties to build understanding before the situation requires formal decisions. A pre-negotiation framework." "What do you get from this?" "Advanced position. When the formal negotiations come, the council members who participated in the back channel will have better information than those who waited. In the internal politics of the Fallen Watchers, information advantage is significant." "You are using this conversation to build your own political position," he said. "Yes," she said, without visible discomfort. Openly. Which I think is more respectful than pretending otherwise. He looked at her. The abyss made a slow assessment. The pressure sense it extended when it was interested in something. I will accept the back channel on 2 conditions, he said. First, the communication is formal enough that it can be presented to your full council when the time comes, so it cannot be dismissed as unofficial contact. Second, the Compact's council is informed. I do not conduct diplomacy that my own council does not know about. She blinked. Not a large expression. A micro-expression, the kind that happens when something exceeds expectations in a direction you had not prepared for. Most parties in your position would treat council transparency as a vulnerability, she said. Most parties in my position are managing relationships between entities who cannot independently verify what they are told. If I conduct diplomacy my council cannot verify, I am asking them to trust me rather than to trust the structure. A structure built on personal trust collapses when the person is removed. He paused. I have made that mistake before. I do not intend to repeat it. She was quiet for a moment. Your conditions are acceptable, she said. Good. I will draft a framework. Send it to you by the method you used to contact Kaido, which I assume is reliable. How do you know she did not initiate contact with me? Because Kaido does not initiate contact with surface parties without bringing it to the council first. She is principled about her protocols. He looked at Seraphina steadily. You reached out to her. A pause. Yes. I am not concerned about it. But I want you to understand that my council is not a weakness in my structure. They are the structure. She looked at the ocean around her and at the young man standing at its edge and at the shadow he cast, which did not follow the rules shadows follow. I will tell my minority faction that I have made contact, she said. I expect they will want to meet the council when the back channel framework is established, he said. Not before. Sequence matters. She nodded. Something in her posture had shifted, a small but complete reorientation, the body language of someone who has recalibrated the nature of what they are dealing with. She left across the water, walking it the way she walked solid ground, and the ocean let her, which was a courtesy it did not extend automatically. Chapter 10. Sora's name. The intermediate depth, midsummer. He had been in the water for 6 hours when Sora found him. She was not looking for him specifically. She had been making her rounds of the intermediate depth territories, the work she had taken on as her primary compact function, the maintenance of the communication network between the coastal entities and the open ocean presences, the relay points and the protocol checks, and the long patient labor of keeping a structure operational rather than merely theoretical. She had, in the months since the compact's formation, become exactly what she had seemed potentially capable of becoming in their first conversation, the person who made sure the thing that was built actually ran. She found him floating at 40 meters in one of her relay points, and slowed to what he had come to recognize as her version of a comfortable social speed. You are thinking, she said? Not an accusation. An observation. I am working through the back channel framework, he said. Trying to draft something that establishes meaningful communication without being a commitment that outruns my mandate from the council. What is the difficulty? Language. Every term I use has implications in the surface faction's legal vocabulary that I do not fully control. I need someone to check my draft who understands the Fallen Watcher's contractual traditions. And you do not have that. Not yet. It is a gap. Sora drifted beside him in the easy way of something that had no buoyancy concerns. The intermediate depth around them was occupied by its usual population of creatures that navigated between the sunlit zone and the deep, the travelers of the ocean's vertical gradient, and they gave Issei the wide berth that the ocean's inhabitants had begun, collectively and without any formal announcement, to give him. There is an entity in the southern intermediate depth, Sora said. She is old enough to have interacted with surface factions directly during the last century. Devil houses, I believe. She has been in the compact as a peripheral observer since the Second Council and has not moved to full membership. Why? Her experience with the surface factions was not positive. She is cautious. What is her name? She uses different names in different contexts. She called herself something that translates to the Keeper of Broken Promises when she introduced herself to the compact. I found this to be an effective summary of her perspective. She understands surface contractual traditions because she has been on the wrong end of one. That was my inference. He considered this. An entity with direct experience of surface faction contracts, and a resulting skepticism would be useful precisely because of the skepticism. A framework reviewed by someone who had reason to look for the places where it could fail would be more robust than one reviewed by someone with no such experience. Can you bring her to me? She would not respond well to being brought to anyone, Sora said. She would respond to being asked. Will you ask her? Yes. With the qualification that she may decline. If she declines, ask her what it would take for her to be willing. Then tell me what she says. Sora's bioluminescent eyes shifted toward the warmer end of her spectrum, which was the closest she had come, in their months of working together, to an expression of uncomplicated approval. You manage people well, she said. Even the ones who do not want to be managed. I try not to manage them. I try to understand what they are actually asking for and find out if I can provide it. That is management. Perhaps. It feels more like listening. She drifted away through the blue-green intermediate light on her network rounds, and he floated in the relay point and watched her go and thought about the compact, about its shape at 5 months compared to its shape at founding, about the places where it was stronger than he had projected and the places where it had not yet reached what it needed to be. The abyss was, as it always was, attentive, present, interested. What do you think? He asked it. The response came as depth, as the sensation of looking down into something very far away and understanding that the bottom had not been reached. It was not precisely a word, but the closest surface language approximation of what it communicated was, more, he agreed. The keeper of broken promises. She came to him 2 weeks later in the southern intermediate depth, at a location she had chosen, at a time she had specified, with a manner that communicated from the first moment that she had considered not coming and had decided to come anyway, and was reserving the right to leave. She was compact in her form, more defined than most of the intermediate entities, with the particular sharpness of something that had been forced to be precise about itself in situations where imprecision had costs. Her eyes were a color he did not have a name for, a dark amber that was also the color of something scorched. Her name, she told him when she arrived, was Yomi. I told you it would translate that way, she said, meaning the name he had known her by. But that is not my name. That is my description. I keep them separate. Yomi, he said. Thank you for coming. Sora asked me. I have a high opinion of Sora. She looked at him with the level gaze of someone who had decided to spend exactly as much trust as had been earned and not 1 unit more. What do you need? He showed her the back-channel framework draft. He did not explain it first. He gave it to her, in the format he had developed for communicating documents through the compact's water-based channel, and he waited while she read. She read for a long time. Longer than the document required. She was reading the gaps, he understood, the places where the language was precise and the places where it was not. 3 places where this can be used against you, she said, when she was done. Do you want them in order of severity, or in order of how easily they can be fixed? Severity, he said. She told him. All 3 were real. The first was a clause in the communication protocol section that could, under the Fallen Watcher's specific interpretation of formal acknowledgement, be read as the compact accepting the Council's jurisdictional framework as a precondition for the back channel, which would imply that the compact operated within the Council's authority rather than alongside it. The second was a timeline ambiguity that could be weaponized to declare the back channel invalid if one party decided to do so. The third was a definitions gap that left the term interest unspecified in a way that the surface factions routinely used to expand scope beyond what the other party had intended. He revised all 3 on the spot, in front of her, using her corrections. She watched him work with an expression that was incrementally, against what appeared to be its default direction, moving toward interest. You take corrections well, she said. The corrections are correct. Taking them is the efficient response. Most people who build things develop an attachment to the original construction. The correction feels like a criticism of the builder rather than an improvement of the building. I am trying to build something that works, he said. Not something that reflects well on me. A silence. The devil house that had a contract with you, he said. The bad one. What did it cost you? He had not planned to ask this. But she had been thinking about it throughout their conversation, and he could feel the weight of it in her attention. She was quiet for long enough that he thought she would not answer. Territory, she said. 200 years of accumulated range. The contract was for a specific arrangement. The scope expansion clause I told you about, the undefined interest term. They used it 7 times over 40 years. By the time I identified the mechanism, the territory had been transferred through 3 subsequent agreements, and I had no legal standing to recover it. I am sorry, he said. It was a learning experience, she said, in a tone that indicated she was aware of how inadequate that description was. It should not have happened. The contract was designed to produce that outcome. Yes. The compact does not operate that way, he said. I am telling you this not to ask you to believe it now but to invite you to watch and determine it for yourself over time. But I will say it explicitly, scope expansion without full council approval is prohibited in our framework. Not discouraged. Prohibited. She looked at him with the amber-scorched eyes. I will remain as an observer, she said. For now. That is sufficient, he said. And your corrections to the framework are in the council record. Your contribution is noted. You are putting my name on a document associated with the compact. You earned it. Attribution is accurate record-keeping. The amber eyes held a quality he thought might, given enough time, develop into something warmer. Sora has good judgment, she said, which was her way of saying something else. She does, he agreed, which was his way of hearing it. Chapter 11, The Devil's Offer. The village, late autumn. The devil came without a boat, and without the studied informality of Seraphina's careful calibrations. He arrived on the dock at noon on a clear day with the directness of someone who had decided that the opening position in this negotiation was going to be presence, sheer physical presence, the kind that preceded him through a room and made rooms feel smaller. He was tall and formally dressed in the way of old devil houses, not fashionably formal but structurally formal, the formality of an institution wearing a person rather than the other way around. His power signature was visible to anyone with the eyes to read it, a high-class devil with territory and lineage and the particular gravity of accumulated centuries. His name was Lord Dantalion, which Issei knew because Seraphina had warned him, through the back channel, that the more aggressive of the devil houses was preparing direct contact. He had prepared accordingly. Issei Nakamura, Dantalion said. His voice carried the resonance of someone who had spent centuries in rooms where their voice was the one that ended discussions. Lord Dantalion, Issei said. Welcome to the coast. I hope the journey was not inconvenient. A fractional pause. He had not been expected to know the name. You were informed of my visit. I maintain adequate intelligence, Issei said. Please come in. I made tea. Dantalion was, once separated from his entrance, a more interesting figure than the entrance suggested. He had the analytical quality of a genuinely intelligent person who had been in positions of power long enough that he had stopped needing to demonstrate intelligence and had started using it instrumentally. He looked at the fishing house without contempt, which was the polite option, and without performed respect, which was the honest option. He simply looked at it. You have built something significant, he said, sitting across the table. He had accepted the tea, which Issei noted as a small signal. Accepting hospitality was a commitment to a conversational register. He was choosing the register deliberately. The compact is establishing itself, Issei said. In 7 months, you have organized every depth category of the world's oceans into a governance structure, resolved a century-old territorial conflict in the Eastern Deep, established formal back-channel communication with the Fallen Watchers minority faction, and sent a notification to every major surface faction that your compact now governs the operational territories they have been using without acknowledgement. He picked up his tea. That is not establishing. That is building. Thank you. It was not a compliment. It was a characterization. But the corner of his mouth suggested he understood that the distinction was not as clean as he had drawn it. My house has been the structure of the supernatural world for a long time. We are accustomed to being the ones who build. That must make this conversation interesting, Issei said. Dantalion was quiet for a moment. Then, briefly and completely, he smiled. It was the smile of someone who had not expected this particular tone from a young man in a fishing village and was revising his model. My house's position, he said, returning to formality with the ease of someone who wore it rather than being worn by it, is that the compact represents an unacknowledged power structure in territories that our operational agreements affect. We do not dispute your right to organize the ocean's inhabitants. We do dispute the framework under which you have notified us rather than consulted us. Notification was the correct first step because the compact's formation did not require your consultation, Issei said. The ocean's inhabitants organized themselves. I assisted. No surface faction's permission was needed for that, any more than my house's permission was needed when your faction organized the Underworld. Dantalion's eyes sharpened slightly. This was the argument he had come prepared to make himself, applied in reverse. The operational agreements we use those territories for are not trivial, he said. They affect significant portions of our communication and transit infrastructure. I know. That is why I sent the notification before moving to formal enforcement rather than after. I am inviting an agreement that protects your operational infrastructure and formally acknowledges it. The alternative, in which we move to formal enforcement without an agreement, is worse for both parties. You are offering us the choice between cooperation and a conflict, Dantalion said. I am offering you the choice between cooperation and the natural consequences of the compact governing its own territory. The conflict framing is yours. A pause. Long enough to constitute genuine consideration. What would an agreement look like? Dantalion said. He had prepared this. He presented it fully. The same structure he had used with Seraphina's back-channel framework and improved with Yomi's corrections. He had made it comprehensive because Dantalion's house had the legal sophistication to find gaps and the motivation to use them. Dantalion listened without interrupting, which was, in Issei's experience, the behavior of someone who was going to have specific objections rather than general ones. The objections came. They were specific. He had prepared for all but two of them. The two he had not prepared for were both legitimate points, and he said so and committed to addressing them in a revised draft. You are willing to revise, Dantalion said. The objections are correct. Revision is the appropriate response. Most parties treat concession as weakness. Most parties are managing their appearance. I am trying to produce a workable agreement. Dantalion looked at him with the full, unguarded attention of someone who had decided that performance was no longer necessary. You are not what I expected. What did you expect? Something that would need to be managed. A power that had emerged from an uncontrolled environment, and would require containment, or co-option. I can see why that would be the working assumption, Issei said. And instead I am talking to you, Issei said. Because I want an agreement, not a conflict. And because your house is sophisticated enough that a conflict with it would be expensive for both parties and would consume resources I would rather spend on building. You are thinking long-term. I am always thinking long-term. Short-term thinking is how you end up winning arguments while losing positions. Dantalion finished his tea. He set the cup down with the precise placement of someone who was making a decision. My house will consider the agreement, he said. I will require the 2 revised clauses before we can move forward. I will also require a meeting with one of your council's senior members. Not you. Someone from the compact itself. Why? Because I want to understand whether the compact is an organization or a personality. Whether it stands on its own structure or whether it stands on you. He had been asked a version of this question before. He gave the same answer he had given Abyssia, that a compact that depended on him was a failure. And he added, I will arrange a meeting with Abyssia. She is the oldest member of the Compact's council. She has been in the ocean since before your house's founding. She does not require me to speak for her. Dantalion was still for a moment. Abyssia. I have heard that name in old documents. Yes. The documents are accurate. She is not comfortable in surface environments, but she communicates well through water. If your house has coastal property, she can be reached there. We have a great deal of coastal property, Dantalion said, and this time the corner of his mouth moved completely into a smile. Very well. Send me the revised draft. I will arrange the meeting with Abyssia through whatever channel you specify. He stood. He looked around the fishing house one more time, at the salt-worn walls and the table and the window with its view of the ocean, and his expression carried something that was neither condescension nor performance but something genuinely like respect, the kind that appears when a thing turns out to be more than you thought it was. "You are going to be very difficult to manage," he said. "I am not asking to be managed," Issei said. "I am asking to be recognized." "Those are," Dantalion said, moving toward the door, "sometimes the same thing." Chapter 12. What the Deep Considers. The Compact's Third Council, 8 months in. He had not been sleeping well. Not from anxiety, which he had managed well enough in the preceding months, but from the quality of the Abyss's activity at night, the way it moved in him while he slept, not restlessly but intently, the way a mind moves when it is working through something large. He had the impression, not for the first time, that the Abyss was processing its own version of the situation, reaching conclusions that it was not yet ready to share. He had learned not to push. The Abyss shared in its own time and its own grammar, and the information it shared was always more useful than what he could have extracted by demanding it early. He carried the tiredness to the Third Council and sat at the head of the chamber with the particular composure of someone who has learned to function on internal reserves, and ran the meeting. The Compact had, in 8 months, grown to encompass 23 full members, 11 observers, and a governance structure that covered the coastal waters, the intermediate depth, the open ocean, and the majority of the deep floor. It had resolved 14 disputes, established the communication network that Sora maintained with the quiet thoroughness of a master of infrastructure, and sent formal notifications to 12 surface faction operational entities. 3 of those 12 had responded positively. 2 had responded with what could be charitably described as aggressive ambiguity. 7 had not responded. Dantalion's house was in advanced agreement discussions. The unbroken current had joined and had brought with it the 4 Eastern Channel entities as promised, and had proven, in the months since joining, to be exactly what a 400-year territorial sovereign with unchallenged experience was when given a governance structure: reliable, thorough, and deeply impatient with anything that wasted time. Yomi had not joined. But she came to the Third Council for the first time as something between an observer and a participant, sitting at the edge of the chamber with the amber eyes moving through everything with the thoroughness of someone checking for the problems that everyone else had missed. She had sent him corrections to 2 drafts in the weeks between councils, unprompted, each correction accurate. He opened the Third Council as he had opened the second, with a report. But the report this time was different in character from the previous ones. The first report had been a founding statement. The second had been an operational update. This one was a position assessment, an honest accounting of where the Compact was strong, where it was not, and what the next phase of development required. He gave it without managing the difficult parts. The difficult parts were the 7 non-responding surface factions, one of which had begun moving operational assets through Compact territorial waters in a pattern that looked like a test. The political situation within Dantalion's house, which was not yet resolved and whose resolution would set a significant precedent. The 3 peripheral observer entities who had been in observer status for more than 4 months, which was long enough that their continued observation was becoming a statement about the Compact's attractiveness rather than a reasonable evaluation period. He presented these as clearly as he presented the strengths. The Council's response to this kind of transparency had evolved over the 3 councils. The first council had been somewhat surprised by it. The second had received it as expected. The third received it as the working norm, which was what he had wanted, a culture in which accurate assessment was the standard rather than the exception. The faction moving assets through our waters, the current said, with the directness of cold deep water applied to a political question. You have a response prepared. A formal notification of the specific transit, Issei said. With a request for acknowledgement. Not a challenge. A documentation. And if they do not acknowledge, then we document the non-acknowledgement, and we continue to document every subsequent transit. We build the record. The record does not stop the transits. Not immediately. But it establishes the factual history for every conversation we will have about this territory going forward. We do not have the capacity yet to enforce our territorial governance against a resistant major faction. We will. The record ensures that when we do, the factual basis is unambiguous. Kira, The cold water entity who had asked the blunt questions at the second council, said, "How long until we have that capacity?" He had thought about this carefully. At the current growth rate, 12 to 18 months. When the Compact's membership covers the full territorial scope of the contested waters, the physical control question answers itself. We do not need to match the surface faction's military capacity. We need to control the territory that makes their military capacity relevant. A silence that had the quality of something being understood. The ocean itself, Abyssia said from the deep current. Yes, Issei said. The surface faction's military operations require transit. They require supply chains. They require communication. All of it crosses our territory. We do not need to fight them. We need to govern what they travel through. That is a long patience, Nami said, from the open ocean above. I know. But it is durable. An arrangement based on military capacity shifts every time the relative capacity shifts. An arrangement based on territorial governance is structural. The Council considered this. The bioluminescent walls shifted slowly through their spectrum, the ambient light of things that made their own illumination. Kaito had been quiet through most of the Council, which was unusual for her. She spoke now, and what she said changed the tone of the room. There is a power approaching from the north, she said. I felt it this morning. Not a surface faction's emissary. Not a deep entity. Something in between. Something that has been in the water for a long time but has been alone in it, not part of any structure. Alone, Issei said. For how long? I cannot tell. Long enough that being alone has become its condition rather than its circumstance. That is a different kind of entity. He thought about this. An entity that had been in the ocean's waters long enough to be ancient, that had not been part of any previous structure, that was now approaching. Does it feel hostile? Sora asked. It feels, Kaito said, choosing her words with the precision she always used when precision mattered, like something that has heard about the compact, and cannot decide if it is interested or if it has decided that interest is a form of vulnerability. I will go north, Issei said. No one objected. He had noticed, over the 8 months, that the Council had stopped suggesting he should bring backup for these initial contacts. They had observed enough initial contacts to understand that backup changed the message. He added, after I have sent Dantalion's revised draft. The current made the pressure sound that was its version of a short laugh. You do not rest. I rest, he said. I just schedule it after the work. And before it? Kira said. And before it too, when possible. The Council closed. The entities dispersed into the water in their various directions, each to their territories and their work and the specific gravity of what they were building together. Yomi stayed longest, watching the chamber empty. He waited. The northern entity, she said, when they were alone in the chamber's water. It is afraid of the compact. You felt it too. I have felt things afraid of structures before. The texture of it is recognizable. She paused. Be careful how you approach it. Things that are afraid and also old are more dangerous than things that are just powerful. I know, he said. Thank you. She departed. He remained in the chamber alone for a moment, which was a thing he rarely allowed himself, and let the abyss process the full weight of the day. 12 months ago he had been a young man on a coast with a power he had not yet decided how to use. 8 months ago he had sat in this chamber for the first time with 11 coastal entities watching him with the careful attention of things deciding whether to trust. Now Dantalion's house was in agreement negotiations. Seraphina's back channel was operational. The current guarded the eastern deep. Abyssia's deep floor was fully represented. Sora's network carried the compact's communications through every depth. Yomi watched for the places where the structure could fail. And something ancient and afraid was moving toward him from the north. The abyss stirred, and what it communicated this time was not a word or a pressure or a depth sense. It was a direction. Forward. The north was dark and cold and full of something that had been waiting without knowing it was waiting. Issei had learned, across 2 lives and 8 months of building in the deep, that waiting without knowing it was the hardest kind, the most necessary kind to meet with patience rather than urgency. He began to pack for the northern waters. Act 3, the weight of old silence. Something ancient and alone moves toward what has been built. What it carries will change the shape of everything. Chapter 13, the thing that would not be named. The northern waters, late autumn. The northern waters were cold in a way the southern and eastern waters were not. Not the functional cold of deep ocean, which was the cold of pressure and depth and the absence of sun, but the cold of latitude, the cold of water that had spent centuries in proximity to the world's largest silences. The fishing communities that worked these waters had a saying about the North Sea that translated, approximately, to the water here does not forget, which Issei had found when he arrived to be a more accurate characterization than most local weather wisdom managed. He had been in the northern waters for 4 days. He had not gone looking for the thing Kaido had felt approaching. He had arrived and he had waited, and he had let the abyss extend its awareness through the water the way a root extends through soil, not aggressively, not as a declaration, but as presence, as the simple fact of being there and being what he was. The thing found him on the 5th morning. It did not announce itself. It was simply there, in the water around his small anchored boat, in the way that a change in weather is there before you can point to any specific thing that has changed. The temperature dropped 3 degrees in 10 minutes. The color of the water shifted from the iron gray of the northern sea to something darker, a darkness that came from within the water rather than from the sky above. He sat in the boat and did not move and let it come to its own decision about whether to make contact. It took 6 hours. He ate his lunch. He watched the horizon. He let the abyss manage the waiting, because the abyss was better at geological patience than he was and he had learned to delegate appropriately. When it finally spoke, it did not use the deep current grammar that the compact's members used. It did not use any grammar he recognized. It spoke in the oldest part of the abyss's vocabulary, in the frequencies that predated language, in the register that communicated not words but states of being. What it communicated was, alone, not a complaint, not a request. A statement of condition delivered with the flat precision of someone reading from a document they did not write and cannot edit. Issei let this settle for a moment. Then he communicated back, in the same register, through the abyss rather than through his own limited range, recognized. A long pause in which the water's darkness deepened by another shade. Then afraid. He had expected this. Yomi had told him, and he had trusted Yomi's reading because Yomi had the particular accuracy of someone who had learned to identify the things she most needed to avoid. He communicated back, of what? The response took a long time. Long enough that he finished his tea and poured another cup and watched a pair of northern gannets work a patch of water 300 meters to the east. When it came not as a single word but as an image, communicated in the abyss's deep vocabulary, the image of a structure, walls and order and governance, and alongside it the feeling of something that had been free in the way only completely solitary things are free, with no obligations and no relationships and no cost, and the structure's walls closing around that freedom like hands. He sat with this for a long time. Then he communicated, as precisely as the medium allowed, the compact's walls are not that kind. Silence. Skepticism in the darkness of the water. He tried again. Not with the abyss's vocabulary. In his own voice, out loud, on the surface of the water, where it could be heard or not heard depending on whether the thing in the water chose to receive it. I did not build the compact to contain things, he said. I built it because the ocean's inhabitants were being exploited by the surface world while operating in isolation from each other, and isolation made them easy to exploit. The compact's purpose is not governance for governance's sake. It is collective standing. The ability to say, this is ours, and we have a voice in what happens to it. The water did not respond immediately. You have been alone for a long time, he continued. Long enough that the aloneness is part of how you understand yourself. I am not asking you to give that up. I am asking you to consider whether the freedom you have now, with no walls and no obligations and no cost, is actually freedom, or whether it is simply the absence of anyone to notice that you are constrained by larger forces that you have no standing to address. The silence that followed this was different from the previous silences. It had a quality of attention rather than withdrawal. Issei waited. The darkness in the water lifted, slowly, like the clearing of weather. The temperature came back up by 2 degrees. And from beneath the surface, not far below, something rose to within 10 meters of the hull and held there, either surfacing nor retreating, occupying the middle distance the way a person occupies the middle distance when they are deciding whether to speak. You are patient, it communicated, this time in something closer to the deep current grammar, rough-edged and imprecise like a language being used for the first time. For a surface creature. I am not entirely a surface creature, he said. And the thing I carry is not patient in the way creatures are patient. It is patient in the way that the deep is patient. Which is a different category. What is the thing you carry? He told it, as he had told every entity who had asked, directly and completely. The presence below the hull was still for a long time. I have felt things from the gap, it said. They passed through here. This water was not the same for 300 years after the last one. I know. The gap's entities typically pass through rather than remaining. The abyss chose to remain. Why? It found something interesting. It found me. He looked at the dark water. I cannot explain its choice to you with more precision than that, because the abyss's reasoning operates in a register I do not fully translate. What I can tell you is that in the years since, it has not consumed or passed through. It has built with me. That is unprecedented. Yes. I have found that unprecedented things are generally either a catastrophe or an opportunity. I am working on the assumption that this is the latter. The presence shifted below the surface. It moved closer to the hull, close enough that he could feel its age in the water pressure, not Abyssia's geological age, but something close to it, ancient in the specific way of something that had been in continuous uninterrupted existence for a very long time. What do you call yourself? It asked. Issei. No. What do you call yourself? Not the name. The thing you are. He had not been asked this question in quite this form before. He considered it seriously. I do not have a title for it, he said. I am building something in the ocean. I represent it to the surface world. I am the point of contact between the deep compact and the powers that have ignored the ocean for centuries. That is what you do, the presence said. I asked what you are. The abyss stirred inside him, the way it stirred when something outside touched a question it had opinions about. It communicated something in the deep vocabulary, brief and certain. The closest translation available was, the Lord of what the surface world forgot to be afraid of. The presence beneath the hull was still for a very long time. Then, with the deliberate weight of something choosing a word for the first time, I am Mu. Mu, Issei said. It means nothing. It is the correct name for something that has not had a name before. Will you come to the surface? I would like to see you. A pause. No, Mu said. Not yet. But I will stay. The darkness in the water persisted, but it was no longer threatening. It was the darkness of presence rather than the darkness of withdrawal, the difference between a room with no lights and a room with someone in it who has chosen not to turn them on. That is sufficient, Issei said. I will come back tomorrow. He did. The 5th day. Mu was there when he arrived, which he had not taken for granted. The fact of it, the simple fact that something that had been alone for centuries had chosen to return to a specific location at a specific time because it had said it would, was more significant than it appeared on the surface. He had brought the compact's documents. Not the formal governance framework, which would be the wrong sequence, but the mediation records, the 4 resolved disputes, the channel conflict resolution, the results of the back-channel negotiations. He had translated them into the deep current grammar as precisely as he could and asked Sora, who had the best command of that grammar among the Compact's council, to check his translation. He gave them to Mu through the water. Mu read them. He could feel the reading as attention, a focused and serious weight moving through the documents with the thoroughness of something that had centuries of practice distinguishing between what was written and what was meant. It took 3 hours. The channel dispute, Mu said. The Ridge Sovereign. You gave it acknowledgement. Yes. Why does acknowledgement matter to a sovereign entity? Because sovereignty without acknowledgement is just power, Issei said. Power can be challenged. Acknowledged sovereignty is a fact on record. It is harder to dispute. Most powerful things do not think about this. Most powerful things think about it only after they have lost something they thought was secure. Mu was quiet. The water around the boat moved in a pattern he had come to recognize as consideration, a slow circular motion that had no meteorological cause. I have territory, Mu said. In these waters and in the waters west of here. I have maintained it for 700 years. I have maintained it alone, which has been possible because the northern waters are not contested the way the eastern and southern waters are. There is nothing up here that the surface powers want enough to challenge for. That will change, Issei said. The surface world is expanding. The resources it currently prioritizes will not be sufficient. It will move north. I know, Mu said. I have felt it coming. The way you feel weather. The Compact's territorial governance covers your waters as a matter of scope, Issei said. Not as a claim on your sovereignty. The Compact would represent your territorial interests in any surface negotiation that affects the North. Your sovereignty over your existing range would be formally recorded, in exchange for participation in the mediation system if disputes arise that cross your territorial boundary. Agreement to the communication protocols. Willingness to be contacted through the Compact's channels. He paused. That is all. The Compact does not ask its members to be what they are not. It asks them to be part of a shared record. Mu circled the boat once. The circle was vast, 100 meters of radius, the unhurried survey of something that did not need to rush anything. The thing you carry, it said. What does it say about me? Issei checked. The abyss communicated something brief. It says you are the oldest thing in the northern waters and that you have been a fixed point in this ocean for so long that the ocean itself has organized around your presence in ways that are not fully visible on the surface. It says your aloneness is not a weakness but that it has become a habit, and that habits, in things as old as you, sometimes outlast the conditions that produced them. A very long silence. Your entity is direct, Mu said. It does not value indirection. Neither do I, Mu said. Show me the membership terms. Chapter 14, The Third Faction. The Compact's communication network. 2 weeks later. He was reviewing the back-channel correspondence with Seraphina's minority faction when the message came through the deep current channel from Kaido, relayed through Sora's network with the particular urgency that Sora only applied to messages that justified it. The message said, a third surface faction has sent contact. Not an emissary. A written communication delivered to the coastal waters via a method that suggests they are aware of the Compact's communication infrastructure, and have found a way to use it. This was interesting for 2 reasons. The first was that the written communication meant the faction had intelligence on the Compact's internal workings that exceeded what any of the surface factions had demonstrated so far. The second was that using the Compact's own channels to make contact was a statement, deliberate and precise. We are paying attention. He read the communication. It was from a faction he had not expected to hear from first. Not the Third Devil House, which was still in its aggressive ambiguity posture. Not the Northern Fallen Watcher clans, who had been quiet. The communication came from the independent faction of former exorcists who had separated from their institutional roots and organized themselves in the decades after the 3-faction peace into something that occupied the complex space between the major powers. 2 principled for pure political maneuvering, 2 experienced for idealism. The Compact's leader, who signed the letter with the name Mira and a title that translated approximately to the first accountable, had written something remarkable in its precision. She wrote that her faction had been watching the Compact's development with attention for 4 months. She wrote that they had been particularly interested in the Compact's mediation record, specifically the channel dispute resolution, which someone in her organization had analyzed and found to be structurally superior to most surface faction mediation approaches in current use. She wrote that the faction had no ocean territories and no direct stake in the Compact's territorial governance. She wrote that what they did have was a detailed knowledge of surface faction contractual law and a deep institutional mistrust of power structures that operated without external accountability. And then she asked a question that none of the previous surface contacts had asked. She asked, who holds the Compact accountable, and how? Issei read this twice. He set the communication down on the kitchen table of the fishing house and looked out at the ocean for a long time. The question was not rhetorical. She was not using it to expose a gap and leverage it. She was asking because it was the right question, the one that the Compact had not fully resolved, the one that lived in the space between Abyssia's confidence in his building and Yomi's ongoing observer status, and the 3 peripheral entities who had not yet moved to full membership. He drafted his reply that evening and sent it through the Compact's channels, which acknowledged to Mira that he knew she had found them. He wrote, "The compact is accountable to its council. The council is accountable to its members. I am accountable to the council and to the record we keep of every decision." The honest answer to your question is that the accountability structure is functional but not yet complete, and the most significant gap is exactly the one your question points at: external verification. I am interested in your faction's analysis of how that gap should be filled. I would like to meet. The reply came in 4 hours, which told him something about how prepared Mira had been for his acceptance. It said, "Tomorrow? Come to the northern coastal waters. I will find you." The northern shore, the following morning. She was not what he had built in his mind from the letter. He had assembled an image from the letter's qualities, its precision and its principled directness, and had produced something austere and formal. The person who walked down the northern beach toward where he stood at the waterline was either. She was perhaps 35, weathered in the way of people who spent time in difficult environments, and had come to peace with what that cost, with the particular unhurried quality of someone who was always thinking one step further than the conversation required. She introduced herself with the first name only and no title, and without the calculated informality of Seraphina's first visit. She was genuinely informal. She was thinking about something else even as she greeted him, in the way that very active minds are always doing 2 things at once. "Your back-channel framework with the fallen watchers," she said, before they had been talking for 3 minutes. "The accountability clause you drafted in response to the Yomi corrections. It is better than most surface faction treaties produced for similar situations, but it has one structural gap that will cause a problem in roughly 3 years if it is not addressed." "Tell me," he said. She told him. She was right. The gap was in the escalation pathway for disputes between Compact members and surface faction treaty partners, which currently routed through the Compact's internal mediation but had no provision for cases where the Compact itself was a party to the dispute rather than a mediator. "Who mediates when you are the one being contested?" she said. "Currently, no one," he said. "That is the gap." "Yes." "What is the solution?" "An independent review body," she said. "Drawn from parties with no stake in either side. My faction has played that role in surface disputes for 40 years. We are not popular with the major factions because we do not have a stake in the outcomes, and therefore we produce conclusions that are accurate rather than convenient. You are proposing that your faction become the Compact's external accountability structure. I am proposing that my faction and the Compact discuss whether that is appropriate. The proposal requires the Compact's buy-in. Accountability structures imposed from outside are not accountability structures. They are supervision." She met his eyes. "I am aware of the difference." He looked at her for a moment with the full attention he gave to things that were genuinely new. "Why the Compact?" he asked. "You have not approached any of the major surface factions with this proposal, and you have the same gap analysis for their structures that you have for ours." "I have." They were not interested. The major factions are invested in the absence of external accountability because external accountability limits their operational flexibility. She looked at the ocean. "You are building something different. The question I am trying to answer is whether different means better or merely novel. How would you answer it so far?" "I would say that your mediation record is genuinely better. That your council structure is more honest than most. That the presence of Yomi as a critical observer is either a calculated display of openness or an actual commitment to it, and that I have not yet determined which." "She was not calculated," he said. "She came because Sora asked her, and she stayed because the corrections she made were acknowledged rather than defended against." "That is consistent with actual commitment," Mira said. "Though I note you understood how it would appear. I try to understand how things appear. That does not mean the things are performed." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the water. "What do you want from this conversation?" she asked. "The same thing I want from every conversation," he said. "Accurate information and the possibility of a working relationship. You are consistent. I find consistency to be a reliable long-term strategy." She smiled. The first real expression she had produced. It was brief and clear and genuine. "Bring my proposal to your council," she said. "I will bring yours to mine. If both councils find the concept viable, we can begin the structural discussion." "The concept is viable from my perspective," he said. "I will present it as such." You are willing to advocate for external accountability over your own structure, she said. I am willing to advocate for anything that makes the compact more resilient. External accountability is a strength, not a constraint. If the compact cannot withstand independent review, the problem is the compact. Mira looked at him with the particular expression of someone who has been preparing for a longer argument, and has arrived to find it unnecessary. I will send you the formal proposal by end of week, she said. I will have a council response within 10 days. She nodded and turned to leave. Then she stopped. The thing in you, she said, without turning back. I can feel it from here. My people have a long history with things from the space between. Most of them required careful management. I know, he said. This one does not feel like it requires management. No, he said. It does not. She left. The ocean accepted the fact of her departure with its usual indifference to the comings and goings of surface things, which was not indifference but scale. He stood at the waterline for a while longer, thinking about accountability, about the compact's third year, and what its shape would be, about the northern waters and Mu's slow decision and the gap in the escalation pathway that Mira had found. The abyss communicated something brief and certain. Useful, it said. He agreed. Chapter 15. Kaido's History. The Southern Channel, 3 days after the council report. He had not asked Kaido about her history. He had known her for a year and had worked closely with her for most of it, and had learned her capabilities and her working preferences and the particular precision with which she used words. And he had not asked about the 900 years before the morning she surfaced in his father's fishing channel to see what shadow was moving along the coast. She told him anyway, which meant she had decided the time was right, and he had learned that Kaido's sense of timing was rarely wrong about anything. They were in the Southern Channel, her preferred territory, on a clear winter morning with the light low and the water the particular color of winter coastal ocean, the blue-green gone gray-gold. She was at the surface, sitting on it as she sometimes did, in the position that made her look like someone who had simply decided that the concept of water as a non-solid surface was a recommendation rather than a rule. The third devil house, she said. The one that has not moved from its aggressive ambiguity position. House Malachor, he said. He had identified them 3 weeks ago through Dantalion's indirect communications, which confirmed things he had already suspected from the pattern of the non-acknowledgements. I know them, Kaido said. Specifically. He waited. 600 years ago, she said, this coast was used as a transit corridor for Malachor's operational activities without acknowledgement or agreement. I was here. I had been here for 300 years before they arrived. She looked at the water around her with the expression of someone locating a very old thing in the present moment. I raised an objection. The way that individual entities raised objections before there was a compact to raise them through. Personally and alone. What happened? Nothing formal. I disrupted their transit operations for 4 years. Storms, primarily. Current diversions. The kinds of disruptions that could be attributed to weather rather than intent, because at the time I did not want to be identified. I wanted them to find the coast inconvenient, and use a different route. She paused. They found a different route. They also sent people to investigate the unusual weather patterns. One of those people was perceptive enough to identify the source. Did they make contact? They made a threat, she said. Delivered through the weather investigator, who I do not believe was fully aware of what they were communicating. The threat was imprecise in its specifics but clear in its intent. Stop disrupting operations or the coast would experience disruptions of a different kind. And you? I stopped. Because I had no structure behind me and no allies, and because the cost of escalation was mine alone to bear. She looked at him directly. You understand why I am telling you this. Because House Malachor is the faction whose aggressive ambiguity I am about to address directly, and you wanted me to know the history before I walked into that conversation. Yes. And because I wanted you to understand that what you have built is the thing I did not have 600 years ago. When you walk into that conversation, you walk in with the compact behind you, with Abyssia's authority behind you, with the eastern deep and the open ocean and the northern waters behind you. You walk in with Mu's membership, which is still being finalized but which represents a territorial claim in the northern approaches that Malachor uses heavily. She was very steady. You walk in with the ability to say, this coast is represented. Formally. By a structure withstanding. He looked at her and thought about 900 years of patience, and about the specific quality of patience that is not the absence of urgency but the management of it, the decision to keep building when the alternative is a confrontation you cannot yet win. I will not let them dismiss the coast again, he said. I know, she said. Not as sentiment. As a conclusion reached through evidence. Do you want to be in the room? He asked. Metaphorically. When the conversation with Malachor happens. She considered this. Yes, she said. Not at the table. But in the water. I will arrange it so that the meeting takes place in your coastal waters, he said. If they want to negotiate with the Compact's representative, they can come here. The pale light in her eyes changed. It was not a dramatic shift. It was the specific luminescence of something that has been patient for a very long time, and has just been given a reason to stop having to be. Sora's network report. He had asked Sora for a comprehensive network status assessment 3 months into her tenure as the Compact's infrastructure lead, and she had produced one that was detailed enough that he had spent a full day reading it, and had found 6 things he had not known and 3 things he had suspected but not confirmed. He asked for another one at the 1-year mark. This report was different in character from the first. The first had been a mapping exercise, a description of what existed. This one was an analysis, a description of what the network had become, and what it could do that it could not do 3 months ago, and what it still could not do that it needed to be able to do. Sora delivered it in person, in the intermediate depth relay point where they had spoken before, with the efficiency of someone who had learned to compress a great deal into a relatively short time because she had a great deal to do after this. The network covered every depth category with redundant relay points, meaning that the failure of any single point did not break communication for any member. This had not been true 3 months ago. She had built the redundancy quietly, over the course of the preceding weeks, identifying the single points of failure and resolving them without requiring a council decision for each, because the council had given her operational authority over the network, and she was using it. He noted this. He had given her the authority, and she had used it with precisely the judgment that made the delegation appropriate. The network could now carry 4 simultaneous communication streams between the coastal and deep floor layers, compared to 1 stream 3 months ago. This had been achieved through a protocol refinement that Sora described briefly, in the way of someone who had spent a long time on a problem and had found a solution and had moved on. The gap was the northern waters. Mu's territory was the largest unconnected region in the Compact's scope. The relay infrastructure did not yet extend fully into the northern approaches, which meant that communication with Mu was currently routed through Kaido's channel, which added time and required Kaido's active participation as a relay point. Mu's membership will resolve this, Sora said. Once they are a full member, we can establish direct relay points in their territory with their cooperation. Without their cooperation, the northern approaches are effectively a communication dead zone of significant scale. How significant? The northern approaches cover roughly 20% of the total territorial scope the Compact claims in its notifications to surface factions, she said. A faction that is testing our enforcement capacity would find the northern approaches to be the path of least communications resistance. He had thought about this. Malachor, he said. Their operational routes run through the northern approaches extensively. How close is Mu to finalizing membership? I do not know. That is your assessment rather than mine. Close, he said. I believe. Within 2 weeks. Then I recommend delaying the formal confrontation with Malachor by 2 weeks. That was my plan. Sora was quiet for a moment with the quality of someone who is deciding whether to say the next thing. You already knew about the northern communications gap, she said. I suspected it. You confirmed it with precision. You were testing my analysis. No, he said. I was getting a comprehensive picture from someone who sees the network better than I do. Your analysis was not a test. It was the correct tool for the situation. She was quiet again. You are careful about the difference between verification and trust, she said. I try to be. Trust is what you extend before the evidence. Verification is what you do after. Both have their place, and the confusion of one for the other produces specific types of failure. Which type does your Compact try to avoid? The type where a structure built on personal loyalty collapses when the person is no longer providing the loyalty, he said. I want the compact to work because the structure works. Not because I am in it. Sora looked at him with the cool, precise light of intermediate depth eyes. For what it is worth, she said, I think you will be in it for a very long time. The structure you are building will outlast the structures of most of the surface factions that are currently watching it with suspicion. That is kind. It is accurate, she said. Kindness is a separate question. She departed on her network rounds. He remained in the intermediate depth and thought about Malachor and the northern approaches and the 2 weeks he had available before the confrontation he could no longer defer. Chapter 16. Mu decides. The Northern Waters, 1 week later. He came back to the Northern Waters as he had promised and sat in the small boat in Mu's territory and waited, and Mu came to him in 7 minutes, which for Mu was something close to urgency. You have been thinking about your confrontation with the third house, Mu said. It was not a guess. Mu had been in the water through which the compact's communication channels ran, and while it had not read the communications, it had felt the character of the traffic, the particular urgency that moved through Sora's network in the days before a significant decision. Yes, Issei said. You need my membership before you go into it. I would prefer it. It is not a requirement. The confrontation will happen on the compact's existing basis if necessary. But the northern approaches are the factual center of the confrontation. Yes. Mu circled the boat, not the survey circuit of earlier meetings but something tighter, more deliberate. The water around the hull was very dark. I have been alone for 700 years, Mu said. I know. The aloneness has costs I did not name correctly until recently. Things I interpreted as strength that were actually, as your entity said, habits whose conditions had changed. The abyss is not always tactful. It was accurate. I prefer accurate to tactful. So do I. A pause. The tide was coming in, somewhere behind him, the predictable regularity of the northern shore. I do not know how to be part of a structure, Mu said. I have never been part of one. No one does before they try. The Compact's Council will accommodate your learning curve. The members who joined in the first 3 months had the same uncertainty you do, and they have all found their functional place. Who would I work with? He had thought about this. Kaito has the most direct relevance, because her territory borders the southern edge of yours. But I think you would find Abyssia's company more natural. She operates on a timescale similar to yours and she has a functional approach to the compact that does not require a great deal of social adjustment. The entity from the deep floor. Yes. She has been in the ocean since before the current continental configuration. She communicates in geological time, and she has an accurate assessment of everything. I would like to speak with her. I will arrange it. Before or after the membership formalization, as you prefer. Mu was quiet for a long time. The darkness in the water pulsed once, a slow deep pulse that moved through the hull of the boat, and through Issei, and through the abyss, and registered there as something it took him a moment to identify. It was recognition. One ancient thing recognizing another ancient thing's quality. Before, Mu said. I will speak with Abyssia before I formalize. And then. A pause. I will join. He allowed himself a moment, a single clean moment, of something that was not pride but was adjacent to it. The satisfaction of a piece finding its place in a structure that needed it. I will send Abyssia your location, he said. She will come to you directly. She does not require intermediaries. Good, Mu said. Neither do I. The abyss communicated something in its deep vocabulary, a single frequency, resonant and certain. Home, it said. Or something close enough to home that the distinction did not matter. Chapter 17, House Malachor. The Southern Channel, the confrontation. He chose the timing with care. Mu had formalized membership 3 days earlier. Sora had confirmed the northern relay infrastructure was operational 48 hours after that. Myra's faction had sent the formal accountability proposal to the Compact's Council and the Council had voted to accept the framework with 3 modifications, all of which Myra had agreed were improvements. The Compact was, at this moment, more complete than it had been at any previous point in its 1-year existence. He sent House Malachor a formal communication through the back channel that Seraphina's faction maintained with the Compact. Not through one of Malachor's own channels, which would have given them the register of a supplicant seeking an audience. Through a channel that reminded them the compact had its own diplomatic infrastructure, and was choosing to use it to reach them. The communication was brief. He invited a representative of House Malachor to a formal conversation regarding the compact's territorial governance, and the House's operational activities in compact-governed waters. He specified the southern coastal channel as the location. He specified a date 14 days hence. He specified that the conversation would be conducted in the presence of the compact's council representative for the southern coastal territory, who was Kaido, and that the full record of the conversation would be entered into the compact's formal records. He did not phrase any of this as a request. House Malachor replied in 3 days, which was faster than he had expected, with a communication that managed to be both accepting of the meeting and communicating displeasure at the terms simultaneously, a complex piece of political language that he read with genuine appreciation for the craft of it. The representative they sent was not the House's primary diplomatic figure, which would have signaled that they took the meeting at face value. It was not a minor functionary, which would have signaled dismissal. They sent someone at the middle rank, the rank of serious evaluation, the rank that said, "We have not yet decided how seriously to take this, but we are sending someone with the capacity to decide." His name was Vance. He arrived in Kaido's coastal waters on a cold February morning with 2 attendants, and the particular composure of someone who had been briefed thoroughly, and was withholding his assessment until he had direct data. Issei met him at the waterline. "Thank you for coming," he said. "The House was interested in the invitation," Vance said. His voice was neutral in the professional way, neither warm nor cold, the voice of someone who was not yet communicating anything other than presence. He was perhaps 50, silver-haired, with the quality of someone who had managed a great many difficult conversations, and had developed a preference for starting them slowly. "Walk with me," Issei said, and gestured toward the channel. They walked along the waterline. The 2 attendants followed at a distance that Issei had calculated would allow them to observe without participating. Kaido was in the water to his left, not visible, present. "The House is aware of the compact's development," Vance said, after they had walked far enough that the social expectation of preamble had been satisfied. "I expected so," Issei said. "The House's position is that the compact's territorial notifications represent a claim on operational corridors that have been in use for centuries without issue." "Without issue," Issei said, "is a characterization that depends on whose perspective you apply it to." Vance glanced at him. A fractional shift of attention. "The entities of the Southern Channel had issues," Issei continued. "For 600 years. They were not in a position to raise them formally because there was no structure through which they could be raised. That structural gap is now closed." "You are referring to historical disruptions of House operations," Vance said carefully. "I am referring to 600 years of use of a territory belonging to sovereign inhabitants who were never consulted, acknowledged, or compensated." He kept his voice entirely level. "The compact is not raising a historical grievance. It is formalizing the present reality, which is that those territories are governed and that governance requires acknowledgement from parties operating in them. The House does not accept that the compact has standing to govern those territories," Vance said. "On what basis?" A pause. This was the question Vance had prepared for and had a prepared answer to, and the prepared answer was not as strong as the question, which he could see Vance calculating. "The established framework of supernatural territorial governance does not recognize ocean-based structures as sovereign entities," Vance said. "The established framework," Issei said, "was written by the parties it benefits, and was not put to the ocean's inhabitants for ratification. I am aware of its provisions. It is an interesting document. It contains a territorial sovereignty clause that applies to any organized governance structure demonstrating consistent administration over a defined geographic range." He looked at Vance steadily. "The compact administers a defined geographic range. We have done so consistently for 12 months. The clause does not specify that the geographic range must be surface territory." The 2 attendants behind them had stopped walking. Vance had not stopped, but his pace had slowed. "That interpretation has not been tested," Vance said. "No. But it is available to be tested, and the compact has the resources to pursue it through whatever adjudication framework the House prefers." He paused. That process would be expensive and slow, and the outcome is uncertain. I am offering an alternative. An agreement, Vance said. An agreement. The House's operational corridors and compact-governed waters are formally acknowledged and protected under the Compact's territorial governance framework. The House receives legal certainty for operations it has been conducting in uncertain status for centuries. The Compact receives formal recognition from a significant surface faction, which advances a relationship that benefits both parties going forward. Vance was quiet for a long stretch of the waterline. The House would require substantial concessions, he said. Define substantial. Vance defined them. They were not, Issei noted, as substantial as the phrasing had suggested. They were the standard opening demands of a sophisticated negotiator establishing the outer range of an acceptable settlement, designed to produce concessions that were actually in the target range. He had done this negotiation in a previous life with different parties and different resources, and had learned the grammar of it thoroughly. He addressed each demand. He accepted two without modification because they were genuinely reasonable. He proposed alternatives for three that were equivalent in value to Malachor but structured in ways that did not create the precedents the original demands would have created. He declined one, clearly and with full explanation, because it would have given the House a right to unilateral transit without notification that contradicted the Compact's core governance framework. The notification requirement is non-negotiable, he said. It is not onerous. It requires a 3-day advance communication through the Compact's channel. The Compact does not have approval authority over the transit. We have notification authority. The distinction matters. Why does it matter to you? Because sovereignty without knowledge of what occurs in your territory is not sovereignty. It is nominal governance. I am not building nominal governance. Vance stopped walking. He turned and looked at Issei with the full, undivided attention of someone who has been conducting a careful assessment, and has just received the last piece of information they needed. You are not going to become easier to manage over time, he said. It was the second time in 6 months that a representative of a major surface faction had said a version of this to him. He gave the same answer he had given before. I am not asking to be managed. I am asking to be recognized. The House can have an agreement with an entity that has governed these waters for a year and will govern them for considerably longer, or it can have the legal and operational uncertainty of an unresolved status with the same entity. The agreement costs less. In the water to his left, he felt Kaido's presence shift. Not dramatically. The particular quality of someone who is watching something they have waited for a very long time, finally arrive. I will take the proposed terms back to the House, Vance said. With my recommendation. Which is? That the agreement is in the House's interests, Vance said. It cost him something to say it, not much, but something. He was a man who had come representing a position and was leaving with a different one, and that always had a cost regardless of its correctness. Thank you, Issei said. For the honesty of the recommendation. I am not always honest in negotiations, Vance said. I am honest when the situation is clear enough that dishonesty would be the less intelligent option. That is a more accurate description of good negotiating than most people manage, Issei said. Vance looked at him for another moment, and then something in his expression moved, very briefly, in the direction of reluctant respect. He left. Kaido surfaced beside him. She said nothing. She did not need to. She stood at the waterline next to him and watched Vance and the two attendants walk back along the coast, and the pale light in her eyes was steady and bright in the winter morning. He stood beside her and let the moment be what it was. Chapter 18. The Compact at 1 year. The full council. The anniversary. He had not intended to mark the anniversary formally. It was Abyssia who suggested it, through the deep current channel, in the direct way she suggested things, which was to say she informed him that the council would find it meaningful and that meaningful was worth the time it required. He had learned not to argue with Abyssia about things she had already decided. The anniversary council was the largest gathering the Compact had held. All 27 full members were present. 9 of the 11 observer entities were present. Myra's faction had sent an observer. Seraphina was present through the back channel. Her attention carried through the communication structure Sora had built with the quiet thoroughness that had become the network's defining quality. Mu was present. It had been a member for 3 weeks, and it had not spoken at a council before. It was present now with the quality of something learning what presence in a group felt like after 700 years of absence from groups, processing it carefully. Yomi had joined. She had sent him a brief communication 2 days before the anniversary council. It said, "I will join. The compact has maintained its accountability commitments for 12 months. That is sufficient evidence for a provisional conclusion." She had specified provisional. He had accepted it as stated. He stood at the front of the chamber and looked around it, and let himself see, clearly and without managing the emotion of it, what had been built in a year. 27 members. Every depth category. Every major territorial region of the world's oceans with the exception of 3 isolated ranges in the southern deep that had not yet been contacted. A governance framework that worked, not perfectly, not without its operational difficulties and its ongoing negotiations and its periodic council disagreements, but functionally, producing outcomes that were better than the alternatives by every metric he had established to measure them. A back channel with the Fallen Watchers minority faction that was being watched with increasing interest by the majority. An agreement framework with House Dantalion that was in final review. A confrontation with House Malachor that had produced a substantive negotiation rather than a rejection. An external accountability structure proposed by an independent faction that the compact had voted to adopt. Kaido to his right. Her 900 years and her patience, and the specific quality of someone who had been waiting for something they could not name, and had recognized it when it arrived. Sora to his left. Her infrastructure and her precision and the 60-year territorial dispute that had been the first thing resolved through the mediation system and that had given her, he believed, a direct stake in proving the system could work. Abyssia in the deep current below, ancient and steady as the floor of the world. Nami in the open ocean above, the vastness of the open water attending. Ray, who had handled the Eastern mediations with the quiet thoroughness of someone who had found the work that suited them. Kira, whose bluntness continued to be the most reliable source of the questions the council needed to ask and found it inconvenient to ask themselves. The current, large and steady and impatient with waste of any kind. Mu, in the northern dark, 700 years of aloneness in the process of becoming something else. Yomi, with the amber-scorched eyes, provisional and present. He spoke for a long time. He gave the year's full account, the same honest assessment he gave at every council, strengths and gaps alike. He named every resolved dispute. He named every unresolved one. He described the surface faction landscape, which was more complex and more positive than it had been 6 months ago, and which would become more complex still as the compact's standing solidified. He described what the next year needed to be. The compact's first year established that it could exist, he said. The second year needs to establish that it is durable. Durability requires 3 things. That the accountability structure Myra's faction has proposed becomes operational and genuinely functions. That the House Malachor and House Dantalion agreements finalize and set a precedent for the surface factions that have not yet engaged. And that the 3 uncontacted ranges in the southern deep are reached and offered membership, so that the compact's claim to represent the ocean is actually comprehensive. He looked at the chamber. I do not know what the third year will require. I expect it to require things I cannot currently project, because that has been the consistent experience of the first year. The situations we did not anticipate were more significant than the situations we did, and our responses to them determined the compact's character more than our planned actions. He paused. I am not concerned by this. I have learned to trust the Council's collective judgment in unanticipated situations more than I trust any plan I can construct individually. High praise, Kira said, with the dry flatness of cold water. Accurate assessment, he said. The Council acknowledged this. Not with sentiment, which was not the compact's register, but with the particular quality of attention that is the deep ocean's version of approval, the kind that requires no performance because it has no one to perform for. Abyssia spoke. 1 year ago, she said, from the deep current, the geological voice moving through the chamber's water, a young man with a very old thing inside him sat in this chamber for the first time and said he wanted to build a structure that the ocean had never had. We listened. We were cautious. Some of us believed, and some were skeptical, and some were afraid. A pause. He built what he said he would build. The chamber was quiet. I have been in the ocean for longer than I name in surface conversations, Abyssia continued. I have seen things come and go. Structures and powers and sovereignties, things that announced themselves as permanent and ended quietly. What this compact has built is different in the quality that matters. It is honest about itself. It does not claim more than it is. It does not ask more than it gives. Another pause. I expect it to last. The bioluminescent walls blazed briefly, not from design, from the ambient response of things that make their own light when something significant passes through their space. Mu spoke. For the first time in a council. The northern dark moved in the communication channels with the rough-edged grammar of something learning to use them. I was afraid, Mu said. Of the walls. Of the structure. I was wrong about what the walls were for. A long pause. They are not to keep things in. They are to keep other things from getting in without permission. He had not said this to Mu. Mu had arrived at it independently, through 3 weeks of being inside the compact and understanding what being inside it actually felt like. Yes, Issei said. That is exactly it. The council continued. They worked through the second-year agenda, the specific tasks and timelines and responsibilities, the structural questions that had arisen in the past month and needed council input, the report from the back channel with the fallen watchers, the update on the Malachor and Dantalian negotiations. They argued about 2 things and resolved both, not cleanly but genuinely, the resolutions carrying the marks of the argument. Yomi contributed to both arguments. Specifically and correctly, catching the structural weakness in the first proposed resolution before it was adopted and proposing a modification to the second that made it more durable. She did this as a full member of the compact, with the authority that the membership conferred, and she used it as though she had been deciding to use it for a very long time. The council ended at what the surface world would have called late evening, the particular quality of the deep water darkness that corresponded to the light leaving the sky above. The members dispersed. The chamber emptied in the way it always did at the end of a council, unhurried, the departure of things that had large territories to return to and were not in a rush because the territories would be there. He was last to leave, as he always was. He floated in the empty chamber and let the abyss process the year and communicate back what it found. The abyss communicated for a long time. It communicated in the deep vocabulary, in pressure and depth and the sensation of very large things moving in the right direction. It communicated what 1 year had produced and what the abyss's ancient and particular perspective on production was. The summary, if the abyss's communication could be translated into something as approximate as a summary, was this: the beginning was complete. What came next was the thing the beginning had been for. Issei rose through the water toward the surface. Above him, the night ocean was dark and vast and full of the compact's presence, the 38 entities and the back channels and the network and the accountability framework and the negotiations in progress, all of it moving through the water the way real things move through it, not quickly, but completely. He broke the surface. The stars were out. The northern ones were visible from here, the fixed points that navigators had used for thousands of years to find their way across water that looked the same in every direction. Fixed points were useful. He had learned this in his first life and had applied it in his second with greater precision. You did not steer by the fixed points. You oriented by them. Then you moved. The compact was the fixed point. What came next was the movement. The southern deep had 3 uncontacted territories. The surface factions were watching the Malachor negotiation with the close attention of parties calculating precedent. And somewhere in the network, in the communication channel Sora had built and the back channel Seraphina had opened and the message Mira had sent through the compact's own infrastructure, something was beginning that had not yet been named. He had learned, over a year of building in the deep, that unnamed things were almost always the most important ones. Act 4, the unnamed thing. The surface world stops watching and starts deciding. The deep compact answers. Chapter 19, What the Network Carried. The compact communication infrastructure, early spring. Sora found it on a Tuesday, which was not a day the compact's calendar recognized as significant, but which Sora would later describe as the day the network told them something it had not been asked. She had been running a routine infrastructure audit, the kind she performed every 3 weeks with the thoroughness of someone who had built a system and understood that systems developed problems in the places you had stopped looking. The Northern Relay infrastructure was stable. Mu's membership had produced exactly the territorial communication expansion she had projected. The deep floor channels carried their 4 simultaneous streams without incident. The anomaly was in the intermediate depth relay network, in the band of communication channels that connected Sora's own intermediate territory with the border regions of 3 other members' ranges. It was not a failure. It was a pattern that had no deliberate source, a series of pressure variations in the channel that corresponded to no message any compact member had sent, and no natural current activity in the area. She traced it back 11 days. The pattern had been building for 11 days. Not loudly. Not in a way that would have registered as anything except background variation to anyone who was not paying the kind of attention Sora paid to everything in her network. But it was there, and it was consistent, and consistency in a communication channel that no one was deliberately using meant something was using it without announcement. She brought it to Issei that evening. He listened to her full account without interrupting. He looked at the pattern she had mapped, the 11-day sequence of pressure variations plotted against the compact's communication geography. Something outside the compact is moving information through our channels, he said. That is my conclusion. The pattern is too organized for natural variation, but it does not match the communication grammar of any of our members. Could it be a surface faction? Testing whether they can use our infrastructure? Possibly. But the surface factions have approached our infrastructure from the outside so far. Seraphina used our channels to contact Kaido, but she did so through a point of access that Kaido effectively provided. This is internal movement, through relay points that are not accessible from the surface without knowing where they are. Who knows where they are? Compact members, current and former. The network architecture is not public. We have no former members. Everyone who has joined has remained. Yes, Sora said. Which means either a member is using the network for something they have not disclosed, or something that is not a member has learned enough about the network to navigate it. Issei considered both options carefully. The first was possible and would need to be addressed directly if true. The second was more interesting and more concerning. The Southern Deep, he said. Sora was quiet for a moment. Yes. I had the same thought. The 3 uncontacted ranges. We know they exist. We know they are old. We do not know whether they have been aware of the compact's development. If they have been aware, Sora said, they may have been listening to our channels for some time before making contact, which would explain how they know the network's architecture well enough to use it without announcement. The pattern could be contact, she said. Not the kind we have received before. Not an emissary or a written communication or a direct approach. Something that is not sure yet whether it wants to be contact. Something that is watching us from inside our own network, he said. Something that found its way in before we were looking for it. Respond to it, he said. Sora looked at him. Through the channel directly? Through the channel. In the same register it used. Match the grammar precisely. Do not assert ownership of the channel. Do not ask it to identify itself. Just respond to the pattern with a pattern that says, received. We hear you. We are not threatened. And if it does not respond to that, then we continue to audit and we wait. Things that have spent a long time deciding whether to make contact do not always make it on the first acknowledgement. Sora departed. He remained in the fishing house and looked at the ocean outside the window, at the surface that covered everything the compact had built, and everything it had not yet reached. The Southern Deep had 3 uncontacted ranges. He had planned to travel south and make direct contact in the compact's 2nd year. The plan appeared to be accelerating. The Abyss communicated something brief. Not a word. A quality, the particular quality of a very large and very old thing turning its full attention in a new direction. It was, he had learned, what the Abyss felt like when it recognized something it knew. 3 days after Sora's response, the pattern in the channel changed. Not dramatically. Not with the sudden shift of something that had been waiting for permission and had finally received it. It changed with the gradual deliberateness of something that had been considering for a very long time and had arrived at a provisional decision. The new pattern was more complex than the original 11-day sequence. It had structure in it, Grammar that was not the compact's deep current grammar, and was not any of the surface registers Issei knew, but that the abyss recognized and translated with the particular confidence it applied to things it had encountered before. The translation was not a message. It was a question, rendered in pressure and depth and the specific frequency of something communicating from a very long way down. It said, "Are you what the water has been becoming?" He sat with this for a day before responding. It was the right question to sit with. It was not asking whether the compact existed or what it was. It was asking whether the compact was the fulfillment of something that had been building in the ocean for a long time, something the Southern Deep had been watching develop from the beginning. He responded through Sora's channel, in the Abyss's translation of the Southern Deep's grammar, as precisely as the medium allowed. He wrote, "We are what the ocean chose to become when it decided to stop being ignored." The response came in 4 hours. It said, "We have been waiting for that." He replied, "I know. I am coming south." Chapter 20, The Southern Deep. The Southern Ocean, 2 weeks later. The Southern Ocean was different from the northern waters in the way that two extremes of the same thing are different, recognizably related, and utterly unlike. Where the northern waters were cold with the cold of latitude and the silence of distance, the southern waters were cold with the cold of depth and age, the cold of things that had been accumulating since before the northern ice formed. The light went out faster here. The dark came sooner and went deeper and was a different quality of dark, not the simple absence of sun but the presence of something that had been in the dark for so long that darkness had become its medium rather than its circumstance. He went down slowly, because the Southern Deep did not appear to be something you arrived at quickly without communicating something unintended about your judgment. The abyss was alert in a way it had not been on any of the previous deep dives. Not tense. Not guarded. Alert in the way of something that recognizes the territory it is entering, that has been here before in some configuration, that knows what lives here and has an opinion about the encounter. He noticed this and filed it carefully. The first entity he felt was not the one that had been communicating through the network. It was older. The distinction between old and very old had become meaningful to him in ways it had not been at the start, the way that a person who spends time in old-growth forests begins to feel the difference between a century tree and a millennium tree without being able to articulate the precise mechanism. This entity was beyond the scale he had encountered even in Abyssia's deep floor presence. It had been here before the Southern Ocean was the Southern Ocean. He descended to 300 meters and stopped. Below him, the dark deepened. Above him, the surface light was a dim and distant suggestion. He floated in the middle distance and waited. The entity came up to him rather than requiring him to come down to it, which he understood as a considered gesture. Things that old did not make unintentional movements. It communicated not in the network grammar but in the Abyss's oldest vocabulary, the pre-language of pressure and depth, the communication channel that predated organized speech by something close to geological time. It communicated, "You brought it back." He checked with the Abyss, because he was not certain he had translated correctly. The Abyss confirmed the translation and added something he had not received, a layer of context that the Abyss provided only when it judged context necessary. The Southern Deep's oldest entity had felt the Abyss before. Not this instance of it, not this specific configuration of the thing from the gap that had chosen to occupy a human vessel rather than passing through. But the Abyss itself, the pattern of it, the particular frequency of something from outside the realm that had decided to be present in the ocean. It had felt it long ago, when the ocean was young and the world was new and the things that came from beyond were not yet in the habit of passing through rather than staying. The Abyss had been here before. "What does that mean?" he asked the Abyss directly, out loud, in the water at 300 meters. The Abyss communicated in its own way, which was not linear, which was not sequential in the way that spoken language was sequential. It communicated simultaneously the fact of a previous visit, the reason for leaving, and the reason for returning, all at once, the way that a very large truth occupies all available space at once rather than arriving in pieces. He processed this for a long time. What it communicated, reduced to sequential language against its nature, was this: the Abyss had touched the Southern Deep in an earlier age, before the current configuration of the world's powers, before the devil factions and the fallen watchers and the structures that now managed the surface. It had left because the ocean then was not ready for what the combination of the abyss and an organized deep would have produced. The ocean needed to reach its current state first, needed to become what it had become through the long centuries of the surface world's inattention, before the combination would produce something durable rather than something that consumed itself. It had been waiting for the ocean to be ready. It had been waiting for Issei. He floated at 300 meters in the southern deep and sat with this for a very long time. Then he communicated to the ancient entity waiting below him. I am ready to listen. It rose toward him, slowly, in the way of very old things that have stopped needing to demonstrate power through any mechanism other than their presence. The Southern Council. The entity called itself, in the deep vocabulary translation, something that approximated the first stillness. He did not give it a simpler name the way he had named other entities, because the first stillness was not an entity that needed simplification. It was precise about itself. It governed 3 ranges in the southern deep that together constituted the largest single territorial claim in the Compact's governance scope, larger than Mu's northern range, larger than the open ocean presence of Nami, on a scale with Abyssia's deep floor territory. The 3 ranges were distinct in their character but unified in their governance, having been administered by the first stillness as a single integrated territory for longer than the current surface world had been organized around the powers that now ran it. He spent 4 days in the southern deep. He did not rush, and the first stillness did not rush him. They communicated in the old vocabulary and in the Abyss's translations and in the patient grammar of 2 things that understood that the conversation they were having was not a single meeting but the beginning of a relationship that would take much longer than 4 days to fully establish. He learned things in those 4 days. The first stillness had watched every development in the Compact's first year from the distance of the southern deep, through the communication channels of the ocean itself rather than through any formal observation structure. It had not needed Sora's network to observe. The ocean carried information the way the atmosphere carries weather, and the first stillness had been reading that information for longer than the northern waters had been cold. It had been watching him specifically. Not the Compact as a structure, though it had assessed the Compact's structure with the thoroughness of something that had seen structures succeed and fail over a very long span. It had been watching him, the combination of him, the human component and the abyss component, and the particular result the 2 produced together. Why specifically? He asked on the 3rd day, because by the 3rd day he had developed enough of the first stillness's communication grammar to ask a direct question and expect a precise answer. Because the abyss has tried this before, the first stillness said. Not in this configuration. Not with a human vessel that was also a sovereign intelligence in its own right. The previous configurations were less stable. The abyss is trying to find the configuration that holds. It has not told me about the previous configurations. It would not. They failed. The abyss does not find failure as interesting as progress. He looked at this from multiple angles. Are you telling me this to warn me? I am telling you this because you deserve accurate information about what you are part of, the first stillness said. The previous configurations failed because the vessel was not capable of managing the combination over time. The abyss presence in an insufficiently capable vessel eventually overwhelms the vessel's own character. The vessel becomes a conduit rather than a partner. The abyss then has nothing interesting to work with, and it departs. And what makes this configuration different? You, the first stillness said, with the flat simplicity of something that has reached a conclusion through evidence. You have spent 2 years building a structure that does not depend on you. You have systematically reduced your own indispensability to the Compact, not by withdrawing but by creating the conditions under which the Compact's other members can make decisions without you. This is the opposite of what a vessel being overwhelmed does. A vessel being overwhelmed becomes more central, not less, because the influence produces a gravitational quality that pulls everything toward the vessel. You have been watching for that quality. Yes. For 12 months. I have not observed it. He processed this. The abyss was present and listening, as it always was, and it communicated nothing, which was its communication when it agreed with what was being said. Will you join the Compact? He asked. I will join all 3 ranges, the first stillness said. With the condition that the Compact's accountability framework, the one proposed by Myra's faction, is fully operational before the joining is formalized. I have watched governance structures fail because their accountability mechanisms were declared but not functional. I will not join a structure whose accountability is theoretical. The framework will be operational within 6 weeks, he said. The structural work is complete. The operational testing phase begins next week. I know, the First Stillness said. I have been following its development. Through the network. Through the ocean. Your network is a subset of what the ocean carries. Everything on it is also in the water. He filed this as something to discuss with Sora. Not as a security concern, because the compact did not conduct its business in ways that required opacity, but as information about the actual scope of what the ocean carried. 6 weeks, he said. Then I will return and formalize the joining. I know you will, the First Stillness said. Not as sentiment. As a conclusion it had already reached. Chapter 21, Dantalion's Agreement. House Dantalion's Coastal Estate, late spring. The meeting with Abyssia had changed Dantalion. Not dramatically, not in the way that visible changes happen in people who have made a decision and are broadcasting it. It had changed him in the quieter way of someone who has updated a fundamental operating assumption and is working through the implications. He had not told Issei about the meeting directly. He had sent a revised agreement draft 3 weeks after the meeting, and the revisions told the story more precisely than a report would have. The places where Dantalion had previously insisted on vague language had been made specific. The places where he had held out for surface-favorable terms had been made neutral. The scope expansion protection, which Yomi had identified as the critical structural clause in any agreement with a major surface faction, was present in the revised draft and was worded with the exactness of someone who had understood the history behind the request. He had spoken with Abyssia for 3 hours. He had not said what was discussed. Abyssia had not said either. The revised draft was the communication. The formal signing took place at Dantalion's coastal estate, at his invitation, in a room with windows on 3 sides facing the ocean. He had chosen the location deliberately, which Issei appreciated. Acknowledging the compact's territory as the context of the agreement was a statement made without having to make it explicitly. Dantalion was present. 2 members of his house's legal council were present. Issei was present. Kaido attended through the water that reached the estate's beach 50 meters from the building, her presence in the compact's channel accessible to him. He had brought Yomi, not to the room. Yomi was not a figure for rooms. But she was in the water with Kaido, and her function in the process was understood. She was the compact's memory of what surface faction agreements had cost in the past, present at the signing of the agreement that was supposed to prevent those costs from recurring. Dantalion's legal counsel was precise and thorough. They raised 4 points of clarification. 2 were genuine ambiguities that required resolution. 2 were attempts to narrow the compact's governance scope through definitional adjustment, subtle enough that they might have passed a less prepared reviewer. He caught both and addressed them without drama. The definition of operational corridor in Clause 7, he said, reading from the revised draft, currently includes the phrase extended operational activity. The compact's position is that this phrase requires a specific time threshold to be defined. Without a threshold, extended becomes a term either party can apply at their discretion, which creates the scope ambiguity the agreement is designed to prevent. Dantalion's senior legal council member, a woman named Prisa who had been doing this for a very long time and had the expression of someone who had been caught doing something they did not expect to be caught doing, said, 30 days. 14, Issei said. 21, Prisa said. 17, Issei said. Final position. A brief silence. Prisa looked at Dantalion. Dantalion made a small gesture of assent. 17, Prisa confirmed. We will draft the specific language. The second adjustment was addressed with the same precision and produced a similar result. A specific number replacing a flexible phrase. A measurable definition replacing an interpretable one. The agreement was signed. Dantalion signed for his house with the fountain pen of someone who had signed a great many significant documents, and had not stopped finding the gesture meaningful. He looked up when it was done and looked at Issei with the particular expression he had produced twice before, the reluctant respect of someone who had expected a different kind of opponent. This agreement will be read carefully by every faction that has not yet negotiated with you, he said. I know. I am counting on it. It is a favorable agreement. It is a fair agreement, Issei said. The distinction matters. A favorable agreement creates resentment. A fair one creates a precedent. Dantalion looked at him for a moment. I told you earlier that you would be very difficult to manage, he said. You did. I should have said, you are very difficult to compete with. The distinction also matters. Issei looked at the ocean through the three-sided window. I am not competing with you. I am building alongside you. The ocean and the surface powers are not in opposition. They have been in ignorance of each other, which is different and fixable. Dantalion followed his gaze to the ocean. The things that live out there, he said, after a moment. Abyssia. What she is. He paused. I have been managing the supernatural world for centuries. I did not know what was in the water. Most people do not look at what they assume they understand. No, Dantalion said. We do not. In the water outside the estate's beach, Yomi received the news of the signing through the compact's channel and communicated back one word. Finally, he heard it and allowed himself a moment of agreement. The back channel response. Seraphina's report to the Fallen Watcher's full council had produced, after 6 weeks of internal debate that she had described to him through the back channel with the precise brevity of someone reporting on a process they found frustrating but were committed to seeing through, a formal response. The response was not the full council's endorsement of the compact. He had not expected that. It was something more useful, a formal acknowledgement that the compact existed as a governance structure representing sovereign inhabitants of the world's oceans, and a request for a meeting at which the compact and the Fallen Watchers Council could establish a communication framework. A communication framework was not recognition. But it was the step before recognition, and recognition was the step before formal treaty, and formal treaty was what transformed the compact from a structure the surface powers were watching into a structure the surface powers were party to. He sent his acceptance through the back channel and asked Seraphina for her honest assessment of the full council's motivation. She replied in 4 hours. She wrote that the Dantalion agreement had moved the council more than any other single development. The Fallen Watchers had spent centuries watching House Dantalion's approach to power with the wariness of entities that did not share the Devil House's worldview. When Dantalion signed an agreement that his own legal counsel described as fair rather than favorable, the full council had to update its assessment of what the compact was. She also wrote, with the directness she had demonstrated from their first meeting, the majority is still cautious. They are engaging because they have calculated that not engaging costs more than engaging. That is a different thing from genuine interest. I thought you should know the distinction. He wrote back, I am aware. Calculated engagement is where most durable relationships begin. Genuine interest is what the relationship becomes if the engagement is consistently good. Thank you for the honesty. She replied, you are welcome. Also, 3 members of the majority faction have asked me privately whether the compact has a formal observer status that does not require commitment. They do not want to be seen publicly expressing interest before the majority position shifts. He had anticipated this. He wrote, the compact's observer status is open to surface factions as well as ocean entities. The terms are identical: presence at open council sessions, access to non-confidential records, no obligation to participate. Send them the framework. A longer pause this time. Then, this is going to move faster than the full council expects. He replied, I know. Chapter 22, The Malachor Confirmation. House Malachor's response. For weeks after Vance's visit, the Malachor response came not through an emissary and not through the back channel but through a formal written communication delivered to the compact's coastal channel with the weight of a house seal and the language of a faction that had spent 4 weeks calculating and had arrived at a position. He read it 3 times before calling a council session. The communication accepted the notification framework and the transit acknowledgement requirement with a modification he had not proposed and had not expected. Malachor wanted a reciprocal notification right. The right to be informed in advance of any significant compact council decision that affected operational corridors and its recognized transit routes. He read this carefully. He read it again. It was not an unreasonable request. It was, in fact, a request that demonstrated Malachor had understood the compact's structure more clearly than he had assumed. A reciprocal notification right was not a veto. It was not even an approval process. It was the same thing the compact had asked of Malachor in reverse, an acknowledgement that decisions affecting shared territory should not arrive as surprises. It was, underneath the House's language and posture, a request for the same thing every entity that had joined the compact had asked for in the moment before joining, acknowledgement. He brought it to the Council. The Council response was divided in an instructive way. The unbroken current, predictably, was skeptical. Giving a surface faction advance notice of compact council decisions, even non-binding notice, created a pathway for surface faction influence over compact deliberations that the current found structurally dangerous. Hyoudou, less predictably, supported the modification. 600 years of history had given her a precise understanding of what being on the wrong side of information asymmetry felt like, and she made the argument that requiring Malachor to notify the compact of transits, while the compact gave Malachor no equivalent acknowledgement, was an asymmetry that would produce resentment, and eventual non-compliance. Abyssia's response, through the deep current channel, was characteristically spare: give them the notification. A house that asks to be informed rather than to be consulted is a house that is trying to work within a structure rather than control it. Reward the distinction. Yomi was quiet for a long time, which meant she was working through the contractual implications with the thoroughness that had made her contributions to every previous compact document valuable. The notification right requires a scope definition, she said finally. Significant compact council decision is a phrase that Malachor will interpret broadly, and we will interpret narrowly. Define it before you agree to it. What definition do you recommend? Decisions that directly modify the governance status, recognized boundaries, or formal agreements of territories adjacent to Malachor's recognized transit routes. Nothing broader. And the notification window needs a specific time requirement, 14 days minimum, so that Malachor cannot use receipt of notification as a basis for claiming that insufficient time was given. He drafted the scoped modification with Yomi's parameters and presented it to Malachor through the formal channel. Malachor accepted within 48 hours. The speed of acceptance told him something important. The House had not been holding out for better terms. It had been waiting to confirm that the compact would engage with its request seriously rather than dismissing it. The 48-hour acceptance was the answer to that question. He sent Vance a brief personal note alongside the formal agreement confirmation. He wrote, "I understand now what the House was asking for. I should have offered the reciprocal framework in the initial proposal. The oversight was mine," Vance replied in a day. He wrote, "You identified it when it mattered. That is sufficient. The agreement is in the House's interest and is well structured. I will implement the notification framework personally." He read this and thought about the 600 years Hyoudou had waited for this coast to be represented, and about Yomi's 2 centuries of territorial loss, and about what it meant that the House that had produced both of those histories had just agreed to notify the compact before conducting operations in the waters they had used without acknowledgement, since before either of those entities could have imagined a structure like this. The abyss was quiet. Not absent. Quiet in the way of something that is observing a moment with full attention and does not want to interrupt it. He let the moment be. Chapter 23. The Accountability Reckoning. Myra's Faction, the first external review. The accountability framework had been operational for 6 weeks when Myra requested the first review. Not a review of a specific compact decision, which was the framework's primary intended use. A review of the framework itself, a meta-assessment of whether the structure they had built to provide accountability was itself accountable in the ways it needed to be. He had agreed to this without hesitation, because a faction that was willing to audit its own audit structure had demonstrated a commitment to genuine accountability rather than performed accountability, and the distinction was important to him in a way he had not fully articulated until Myra named it. She came to the coastal waters for the review, which she had asked to conduct in person rather than through the back channel. She brought 2 members of her faction who were introduced as the review team, and they were both people he had not met before, which he read as Myra ensuring that the review was conducted by people without prior relationship investment in the compact's leadership. They spent 2 days reviewing. They reviewed every council decision from the compact's first year. They reviewed the mediation records. They reviewed the communication logs from the back channel with the fallen watchers. They reviewed the negotiation records for both the Dantalian and Malachor agreements. They had access to everything, because he had given them access to everything, because a review conducted on partial information was not a review. It was a performance. Mira conducted the review with the particular quality he had identified in their first meeting, the quality of a mind that was always thinking one step further than the current conversation and that applied its full resources to whatever it was currently doing. She asked questions that were not rhetorical. She caught inconsistencies between his stated principles and specific decision records, 3 of them, each one small and each one real. He had caught 2 of them himself in the preceding months. The third was new. She presented the 3 inconsistencies without softening them. They sat across a table in a coastal meeting room that the compact maintained for surface world interactions, and she laid the evidence out with the precision of someone who had been doing this for 40 years and did not find the fact of error surprising or the documentation of it comfortable. The third inconsistency, she said, pointing to the record, is in the MU membership process. Your stated principle is that membership formalization requires full council review of membership terms. The MU membership was formalized with Abyssia's direct blessing in your agreement, but without a formal council vote on the specific terms. He looked at the record. She was correct. The principle was not followed, he said. The council received a report after the fact, she said. That is not the same as a prior vote. No. It is not. Why did it happen? He thought about this honestly. Because I was managing MU's timeline and the Malachor confrontation simultaneously, and because the Northern Relay infrastructure was operationally dependent on MU's membership timing. I made a pragmatic decision that the timing window was too narrow for a full council vote and that Abyssia's authority, as the Compact's most senior council member, was sufficient for an expedited process. And was it? It was sufficient in outcome. MU's terms were reviewed by Abyssia and are fully consistent with the Compact's framework. But the principle was not followed, and the principle exists for good reasons, and the pragmatic decision I made was the kind of decision that, repeated enough times, erodes a governance structure from inside. Mira looked at him for a moment. That is an accurate self-assessment, she said. The review exists so that accurate self-assessments can be verified rather than taken on faith, he said. What is your recommendation? Retrospective council vote on the MU membership terms to close the procedural gap. Amendment to the framework explicitly prohibiting expedited single-member approval for membership formalization regardless of timing pressure. Both are reasonable, he said. I will implement both. Without qualification. Without qualification. She made a note. Her review team, who had been silent throughout, exchanged a look he caught and filed. You are the first governance structure we have reviewed that has implemented all recommended amendments without qualification, she said. Most implement some and negotiate on others. The recommendations are correct. Negotiating on correct recommendations is how you end up with a governance structure that feels accountable but functions like one that is not. You have thought about this carefully. I have made the other kind of governance structure before, he said. In a different life. I know what it looks like from the inside when the accountability is nominal. She closed her review documents. The particular closed quality of someone who has completed a difficult task and found the outcome better than expected. The compact passes the first external review, she said. With 3 documented findings and 3 implemented amendments. The record will be public in the framework's standard format. I will add it to the compact's public record, he said. Including the findings. Not just the pass. Her expression moved in a direction he had come to recognize, the direction of genuine surprise controlled by professional composure. The findings too. A record that shows only passes and no findings is not a credible record. It is a document demonstrating that reviews are being conducted as formalities. Most organizations would not see it that way. Most organizations, he said, are trying to appear accountable rather than to be it. She stood. She gathered her documents. She looked at him one more time with the frank, unmediated attention she had brought to every conversation they had had. I told my full faction after our first meeting that you were either the most honest governance architect I had encountered or the best performance of honesty I had encountered, she said. After 2 days of review, I have a conclusion. Which is? The former. With the caveat that honest and strategically capable are not mutually exclusive, and you are both, And that combination is either the most hopeful thing I have seen in 40 years of accountability work, or the most dangerous. I am trying for hopeful, he said. I know, she said. That is what makes it convincing. She left. He sat in the coastal meeting room with the 3 findings and the 3 amendments, and the public record that would carry all of it, accurate and unmanaged, for anyone who wanted to understand what the compact actually was. The abyss communicated something. Brief and warm, in the old vocabulary, in the frequencies that predated language. It communicated, right. Chapter 24, The Price of Standing. The Supernatural Council, 6 months into year 2. The third Devil House moved when it was ready and not before, which was the way old power moved, not in response to pressure but in response to its own internal calculation of when the movement would produce the optimal result. Issei had been tracking the signals for 3 months and had estimated the timing correctly to within 2 weeks. They did not send an emissary. They did not send a formal communication. They sent a request for the compact to appear before a joint session of the Devil Council, a gathering of representatives from all 3 major Devil Houses convened to assess the compact's status under the established framework of supernatural territorial governance. He read this with the careful attention it deserved and then set it aside and made tea and thought about it for an hour before responding. The request was not an invitation. It was a summons, framed in the language of an invitation, with the premise embedded in its structure that the Devil Council had the authority to convene such a session and that the compact was subject to its assessment. Accepting the invitation in its as-written form would confirm both premises without negotiation. He sent a response. He wrote that the compact would be pleased to meet with the joint session of the Devil Council. He specified that the meeting would take place in the compact's coastal waters rather than in the Devil Council's chambers, because the compact was an ocean governance structure and was most accurately represented in its own territory. He specified that the compact's representative would be accompanied by 2 council members rather than appearing alone. He specified that the meeting's purpose was mutual assessment and information exchange rather than formal evaluation, because the compact did not fall under the Devil Council's governance framework and the meeting would be most productive if conducted between parties of equivalent standing. He sent it and waited. The response came in 6 days, which was faster than he had expected for a joint council deliberation, and confirmed all 3 of his specifications. The speed told him something. They had anticipated a version of this negotiation and had decided in advance to accept his terms rather than argue them. Accepting his terms said, "We acknowledge that you have standing to specify meeting conditions." Acknowledging that said, "We acknowledge that you have standing." He had gotten what he came for without attending the meeting yet. The coastal waters, meeting day. He chose Kaido's channel for the meeting location, as he had chosen it for the Malachor confrontation, because Kaido's channel was the place where the compact had begun and because beginning and context were not accidental choices. He brought Kaito and Abyssia. Kaito attended in the water, which was her natural environment and her right, and was visible to the Devil Council's representatives from the surface in a way that was neither concealed nor performed. She was simply present, 900 years of coastal sovereignty at the edge of the meeting's space. Abyssia attended through the deep current channel, her voice moving through the water in the meeting's coastal location the way her voice moved through everything, as geological fact. She did not use a physical form. She did not need to. The representatives felt her presence in the water they stood near and in the quality of attention the ocean paid to the proceedings. The Devil Council had sent 3 representatives, 1 from each house. House Dantalion's representative he recognized, Prisa, the senior legal council member who had negotiated the agreement terms. A courtesy, he thought, sending someone he had already worked with. An acknowledgement that the working relationship was real. The third house's representative was a figure he had not encountered before, formally introduced as the assessor, which was a title rather than a name. The assessor was the kind of person who communicated nothing personal in their presentation, a professional blank, everything channeled into observation. The meeting opened. He had structured it as a genuine exchange rather than a presentation, which meant he asked questions as well as answering them, which meant the Devil Council's representatives received accurate information about the compact and also provided accurate information about the surface power's perspective on the compact's development. He learned several things. He learned that the Dantalian agreement had done what he expected and more, that it had effectively set the terms of what an agreement with the compact would look like for every subsequent negotiation, and that 2 of the houses were already running internal assessments of whether the terms were acceptable for their own operational needs. He learned that the Fallen Watchers' full council's communication framework acknowledgement had alarmed the 3rd house more than any other single development, not because the Fallen Watchers were allies of the compact but because the acknowledgement had moved the compact from the category of unilateral ocean development into the category of recognized multi-party structure. And recognized multi-party structures were substantially harder to challenge than unilateral ones. He learned that Myra's external review had been read carefully by all 3 houses. The record that included the findings as well as the pass. He knew this because the assessor asked specifically about the 3rd finding, the MU membership procedural gap, and the question was not rhetorical. The assessor wanted to understand how the compact's governance structure had produced the error, and what the implemented amendment was designed to prevent. He answered fully. The error was mine, he said. The circumstance produced a pragmatic decision that was inconsistent with the compact's stated principles. The amendment prevents the circumstance from producing the same decision in the future by removing the discretion that made the pragmatic decision available. You removed your own discretion, the assessor said. I constrained it in a specific area where my judgment had already demonstrated a failure mode. That is the appropriate response to an identified failure mode. The assessor was quiet for a long moment. Then they made a note, the first note the assessor had made in 2 hours of meeting. Abyssia spoke through the water. Her geological voice moved through the channel and the coastal air and was heard by everyone present. The compact has governed these waters for 18 months, she said. In that time, 14 disputes have been resolved. 2 major surface factions have formal agreements. 1 independent accountability faction provides external review. The communication framework covers every depth of the ocean. A pause. You are deciding whether to recognize it. I am telling you that the ocean recognized it 14 months ago. You are catching up to a fact that has already happened. The meeting was very quiet. Kaido, in the water at the channel's edge, was still with the particular stillness she had not managed for 600 years. The assessor looked at the water, at the quality of attention the ocean paid to the proceedings, at Issei, and then back at the water. We will report to the Joint Council, the assessor said. A formal response will follow within 30 days. I will look forward to it, Issei said. After the Devil Council's representatives departed, he stood at the waterline with Kaido's surface beside him, and the 2 of them watched the surface world walk away with the compact's terms in its hands and the ocean's words in its ears. 30 days, Kaido said. Perhaps less. Abyssia's contribution was not planned, but it was effective. She did not ask my opinion before speaking, Kaido said, with the dry quality of someone who has an opinion about this, and has decided not to make it an issue. She rarely does. She communicates when she has something precise to say. That is a diplomatic description of geological impatience. He laughed. Not a polite laugh. A genuine one, the kind that arrives when someone says the exact right thing at the exact right moment with the exact right quality of dryness. Kaido looked at him with an expression he had not seen on her before. Not the pale luminescent assessment. Not the 900-year steadiness. Something simpler and rarer. She was satisfied. Not happy, which was a surface emotion that required different conditions. Satisfied in the deep way, in the way that things that have been patient for a very long time feel when the patience produces what it was for. He did not say anything. The moment did not require it. Chapter 25, The Ray Principle. The Eastern Waters, a mediation in progress. Ray had been handling the Eastern mediations for a year and had developed, in that time, what the Compact's other council members had begun to call the Ray Principle, which was Kira's name for it, and which Ray herself found undignified but accurate. The Ray Principle was this: the stated position in any dispute is not the dispute. The dispute is the thing beneath the stated position, and the stated position is the territory the parties defend because attacking the thing beneath it is more vulnerable than they are prepared to be. The Ray Principle said, find the thing beneath and address it directly, and the stated position resolves itself. Issei had been applying a version of this since before the compact existed. Ray had named it, which made it teachable, which meant the compact's mediation function could train new mediators on a principle rather than depending on the individual judgment of people who had already internalized it. He had asked her about this at the last council. "You named it," he said. "That was not accidental. The mediation work requires more people," she said. "More cases are coming. The compact has the formal mediation function but not the capacity to use it at scale. If the capacity is based on individual mediators developing the principle through experience, scaling takes decades. If the principle is named and documented, scaling takes months. You want to build a training structure. I want to bring it to the council. The compact's mediation function is currently its most visible positive contribution to its members. If the function cannot scale, the compact's ability to deliver on its core promise degrades as membership grows. He had brought it to the council. The council had agreed. Ray was now developing the training framework, which she approached with the same thoroughness she applied to everything, which meant she was consulting the entities who had been medis rather than just the mediators, because the medis' experience of the process was the measure of the function's effectiveness. He had watched this development with the specific satisfaction of a person who has assembled a group of people who are better at specific things than he is and has built the structure that lets them apply those capabilities without requiring his involvement in every decision. The compact was working, not in the theoretical way. In the concrete, daily, functional way of a thing that has been built well enough that it runs without constant intervention, that produces its outputs consistently, that develops its own internal improvements through the collective intelligence of its members. He was less central to it now than he had been at its founding. This was the goal, and it was also, unexpectedly, one of the more difficult things he had experienced in its achievement, not because he wanted centrality but because the process of becoming less necessary required a constant active choice, a daily decision not to insert himself where the structure had learned to function without him. The Abyss had noted this. "You are restraining yourself," it communicated one morning, in the early hours when the Abyss's communications were less guarded and more direct. "Yes," he said. "It is the correct restraint," the Abyss said. "I know. It does not make it easier. Nothing correct is easy." That is not what correct means. He had not expected the Abyss to be useful on this particular question and had found, as he found consistently, that the Abyss was useful on more questions than he expected and was precise in a way that was sometimes uncomfortable. The fourth full council. The fourth council was the largest the compact had held. Every full member, every observer, including the 3 Fallen Watcher majority faction members who had requested observer status through Seraphina and had been attending in the deliberate semi-visibility of people who were present, and not yet prepared to be seen to be present. Mira attended as the external accountability structure's representative, which was now a formal role in the compact's governance framework rather than an informal relationship. The first stillness had formalized its membership 2 weeks prior, following the accountability framework's operational confirmation. Its presence in the council chamber was something that required the other members to recalibrate slightly, not because the first stillness was threatening but because its scale and age reset the ambient sense of what old meant. Even Abyssia, who was not easily moved by the scale of others, had acknowledged the first stillness's arrival with the particular quality of one very old thing recognizing another. Mu was fully present, in the way Mu had been present at every council since joining, the way of something learning to be part of a group and finding, incrementally and with consistent surprise, that the experience was not what it had feared. He opened the fourth council with the Year 2 progress report. The report covered the Dantalian Agreement in operation for 6 months with no disputes and 3 successful notifications processed. The Malachor Agreement in operation for 4 months with 7 successful notifications and 1 ambiguity resolved through the framework's clarification process. The Fallen Watchers Communication Framework producing 3 substantive exchanges and 2 observer applications from majority faction members. The first stillness's 3 ranges formally joined. Completing the compact's ocean coverage. The Ray Training Framework in development with a target of training 6 new mediators within the year. The Accountability Review record public and unedited. He covered the gaps as he always did. The Joint Devil Council's formal response had not yet arrived. It was 22 days into the 30-day window, which meant it was coming soon, and the nature of its content would significantly shape the compact's relationship with the surface world's primary power structure for the foreseeable future. The third gap was one he had not disclosed at a previous council, not from concealment but from incompleteness. He had been thinking about it for 2 months and had not yet arrived at a formulation he was confident in. He disclosed it now. The compact's current structure was built for the ocean as it is, he said. The governance framework covers the world's waters as a defined territory. The surface world's organizational structures were built for the land mass and its air, the oceans were residual to their design. What we have built is a structure that governs the majority of the world's physical surface. The Council was attentive. The next phase of the compact's development is not expansion. We are, effectively, at the limits of the ocean's inhabited territory. The next phase is depth, not physical depth but structural depth, the process of becoming the kind of governance structure that can operate as a full peer to the surface world's factions rather than as a recognized but junior entity. He looked around the chamber. That requires things we do not yet have. A formal legal identity that the surface world's frameworks recognize. A resource base that does not depend entirely on the goodwill of the surface world's tolerance of our territorial governance. And a relationship with the world's population that is not just with its supernatural powers. The last point landed with the weight of something being said for the first time that had been true for a while. The surface world's ordinary population, Kira said. Yes. The surface world's supernatural powers are not the only parties whose behavior affects the ocean. 7 billion ordinary humans use the ocean's resources, alter its chemistry, affect its conditions. The compact governs the ocean's inhabitants. It does not yet have any relationship with the majority of the agents who affect the ocean's condition. That is a very large scope expansion, the current said. I am not proposing it as an immediate action, he said. I am identifying it as the direction the compact needs to move in over the next 5 years. The immediate action is to begin building the capacity for it. That starts with the legal identity question, which Myra's faction has experience with, and which I would like to discuss formally at this council. Myra, who had been quiet through the report, spoke. The legal identity question is solvable, she said. The established supernatural governance framework has provisions for multi-entity governance structures. The compact qualifies under 4 of the 6 criteria without adjustment. The remaining 2 require documentation that the compact can produce. You have already assessed this, he said. I assessed it when you first disclosed the accountability proposal, she said. I have been waiting for the council to be ready for the question. He looked at her. She looked back with the one-step-ahead quality that had been present in every conversation he had had with her. Thank you for waiting, he said. You are welcome, she said. I find the waiting easier when I know the destination is correct. The council continued. They spent 3 hours on the legal identity question, on Myra's documentation pathway, on the resource-based question, on the 5-year direction. They argued about the ordinary human population question, which was the largest and the hardest and the one that required the most trust to approach because it was outside the compact's current experience, and required moving into territory that none of them had managed before. They did not resolve the argument. They were not supposed to. They were supposed to begin having it, which they had. He closed the council at the end of the day with the summary of decisions made and questions left open, the format he had used at every council, the format that treated open questions as progress rather than failure. The members dispersed. The first stillness remained longest, in the current below the chamber, its ancient and patient presence settling into the compact space the way a very old tree settles into soil, not quickly but completely. 5 years, it said. 5 years to build toward, he said. Not 5 years to wait. I know the difference, the first stillness said. I have spent enough time doing both to know which one feels like which. He descended toward the surface slowly, through the compact's water, through the network Sora had built, and that the ocean had supplemented with its own deeper channels, through the territories of 37 members and 11 observers and 2 surface factions in formal agreement, and the 3 fallen Watcher majority members who were present, and not yet ready to say so. He broke the surface. The sky above was the deep blue of a late afternoon in the 2nd year of something that had not existed before it did. The Devil Council's formal response arrived in the compact's channel the following morning. It was 1 sentence long. It said, the Joint Devil Council formally acknowledges the Deep Ocean Compact as a sovereign governance structure withstanding equivalent to that of recognized supernatural entities under the established framework of supernatural territorial governance. He read it once and set it down. He looked out at the ocean. The abyss was present and quiet and warm with something that, in 18 years of shared existence, it had communicated fewer than a dozen times. Something that had no single word translation but that arrived in the body as the sensation of a long journey reaching a place that was not its end but was unmistakably its first real resting point. He picked up the communication and sent it to the Compact's council. He wrote, alongside it, 3 words. Now we build. The Devil Council's acknowledgement moved through the supernatural world's information channels in the way that formal recognitions moved, completely and irreversibly, arriving in every faction's records as a fact that altered the legal landscape they operated in. In the southern deep, the first stillness received the news and was still for a long time. In the northern waters, Mu felt the acknowledgement move through the ocean's deep channels and communicated something to the water in the old pre-language vocabulary, something that had no word in any surface tongue but that the ocean understood as a release, as the sensation of a very old and very long-held tension finding, at last, that it was no longer needed. In the southern channel, Kaido watched the acknowledgement arrive and said nothing and let the water be the thing that carried it, which was appropriate, which was what the water had always been for.